The air is thick with the scent of burning copal, swirling smoke, obscuring the faces of chanting priests as they circle the towering stone altar. A prisoner, chosen for this sacred moment, stands trembling beneath the gaze of an obsidian-eyed god. The drumbeats quicken, the crowd holds its breath, and with one swift motion, the ritual begins. This wasn't just ceremony, it was survival. The Aztecs believed the very fate of their world depended on these acts of devotion, where lifeblood flowed to keep the sun rising and the crops growing. But behind the grandeur of their empire, hidden in the shadows of towering temples, lay a darker truth, a civilization that wielded spirituality like a blade, where the line between reverence and terror blurred into something few today can fully comprehend. You might wonder how a people so advanced, with sprawling cities, intricate calendars, and breathtaking art, could also embrace rituals that seem unimaginably brutal by modern standards. Yet for the Aztecs, these practices weren't acts of cruelty but divine necessity. Their gods demanded sacrifice, and in return they offered protection, prosperity, even the continuation of time itself. Imagine the weight of that belief. Every sunrise, every harvest, every victory in battle hinged on the willingness to give what was most precious. Blood wasn't just spilled, it was currency, a sacred exchange between humanity and the divine. What we're about to explore isn't just a catalogue of ancient horrors, it's a window into a mindset that saw the world in flames and shadows, where gods walked among mortals and the afterlife was as real as the earth beneath one's feet. Over the next 30 rituals, we'll uncover the chilling, the enigmatic, and the profoundly spiritual practices that defined Aztec life. From the infamous heart sacrifices to lesser-known rites shrouded in mystery, each ritual reveals a piece of a civilization both awe-inspiring and unsettling. So step closer, but steel yourself. This journey into the Aztec world isn't for the faint of heart. The gods are waiting. The new fire ceremony was more than a ritual, it was an act of cosmic desperation, a desperate gamble against the annihilation of the universe itself. Every 52 years, when the Aztec calendar completed a full cycle, the people watched the night sky with a mixture of dread and hope. Priests climbed to the summit of the Hill of the Star outside Tenochtitlan, their eyes locked on the constellation we now call the Pleiades. If those stars continued their path across the heavens, the ceremony could begin. But if they stood still, it meant the gods had turned their backs and the world would end in eternal darkness. The stakes couldn't have been higher. As the constellation reached its zenith, a single captive, often a warrior of high status, was stretched across the sacrificial stone. With an obsidian blade sharper than steel, a priest would carve out the victim's still beating heart, holding it aloft as kindling for the new fire. The moment that flame took hold, messengers raced through the empire carrying torches lit from this sacred source. Every hearth, every temple, every home had to be relit from this single spark. To the Aztecs, this wasn't just fire, it was the rebirth of time itself. But the ceremony didn't end there. What followed was a frenzy of bloodshed that would last for days. Thousands of captives were sacrificed in ceremonial centers across the empire, their blood feeding the gods in gratitude for sparing the world. Temples ran red and the air filled with the metallic tang of sacrifice. Yet amid this horror lay a startling precision. The Aztecs had calculated this ritual down to the hour, aligning it with celestial movements modern astronomers still marvel at today. Their terror was matched only by their brilliance, a people who could chart the stars yet believed those same stars demanded rivers of blood to keep shining. The pyramid staircases of Tenochtitlan became rivers of crimson in those fateful days following the new fire ceremony. Archaeologists have found layers of compacted blood residue between the stones of the Templo Mayor centuries later. The very earth still whispers of the scale of these sacrifices. But this wasn't random slaughter, it was a meticulously choreographed spectacle of devotion. High-status captives, often warriors taken in battle, were led up the temple steps in line so long they vanished into the horizon. Each step brought them closer to the priests waiting at the summit, their obsidian blades glinting under the sun. One of the most chilling discoveries came from excavations at the Great Pyramid, a ceremonial rack where victims were stretched backward over a curved stone, their chests arched upward to expose the heart for extraction. Forensic analysis shows the cuts were precise, almost surgical, made by hands trained through generations of ritual practice, but death was only the beginning. Some victims were flayed, their skins worn by priests in macabre ceremonies that could last days. Imagine the sight, dancers cloaked in human flesh, moving through the streets as living embodiments of gods like Xipe Totec, the flayed lord. Spanish chroniclers wrote of blood pooling ankle-deep in temple courtyards, descriptions once dismissed as exaggeration until modern tools proved otherwise. Ground-penetrating radar revealed networks of channels beneath sacrificial stones designed to drain blood into ceremonial basins. Even the architecture served the ritual. The pyramids were positioned so the setting sun would cast shadows down the steps, turning the streams of blood into shimmering black veins against the stone. For the Aztecs, this wasn't mere spectacle. Each life offered was a thread in the fabric of existence, woven into the cosmos to keep the sun moving, the rains falling, the world alive. Yet beneath the gore lies a haunting paradox. The same hands that carved out hearts also painted exquisite murals, composed poetry about fragile flowers, and charted Venus's path with jaw-dropping accuracy. How do we reconcile these extremes? Perhaps the answer lies in the Aztecs' unshakable belief that beauty and brutality were two sides of the same sacred coin, that to create one must first destroy. Their world was a balancing act of opposites where life demanded death and terror walked hand in hand with transcendence. The flaying of Xipe Totec was no ordinary sacrifice. It was a gruesome metamorphosis, a transformation where death birthed new life in the most visceral way imaginable. Picture this: a captive warrior, often chosen for his strength and beauty, is led to the temple steps not with chains but with honor. He's told he'll become the living image of a god, but first he must die. The priests would tie him to a wooden frame, his body stretched taut as they made the first incision with razor-sharp obsidian. The skin was peeled away in one piece, like removing a glove, leaving the raw muscle glistening beneath. Yet the horror didn't end there. For 20 days, a priest would wear that skin like a second flesh, its empty eye sockets and slack jaw molding to his body as it decayed. This wasn't mere spectacle, it was a profound act of symbolism. Xipe Totec, the flayed god, embodied the cycle of renewal, like a snake shedding its skin or a field stripped bare before new crops could grow. The rotting epidermis, stiff with dried blood, crackled with every movement, emitting a putrid odor that hung thick in the air. By the ritual's end, the priest would remove the disintegrating skin in a public ceremony, casting it into a sacred pit as the crowd erupted in cheers. What seemed like madness had method. The discarded flesh represented the old year's husk, making way for the fertile new season. Spanish chroniclers described temples adorned with flayed skins hanging from doorways like grisly curtains swaying in the wind. Modern excavations have uncovered pits filled with these remains, their fingertips still clutching at the air in silent agony. But perhaps the most chilling detail. Some victims were given pulque, a ritual intoxicant before the flaying, not to dull the pain but to keep them conscious. Their screams were considered sacred music, a hymn to the gods. In the Aztec worldview, suffering wasn't meaningless. It was the price of existence, the vibration that kept the universe humming. The flayed god didn't just demand skin, he demanded proof that life could emerge from even the most excruciating transformation. High on the mist-shrouded slopes of mountains sacred to Tlaloc, the rain god whose tears became storms, priests performed rituals that would chill any modern heart. Children, some barely old enough to walk, were chosen not for their weakness but for their purity. Their tears were believed to call the rains, their innocence a direct line to the divine. These weren't random victims, they were selected with care, often the children of nobles, their faces painted blue like the god himself, dressed in ornate costumes with jade beads sewn into their clothing, each stone a tiny offering, a shimmering piece of the water they were meant to summon. When the dry season stretched too long, when the earth cracked open like a starving mouth, the priests would lead these children up to alpine shrines where the air grew thin. The moment of sacrifice wasn't quick or hidden. Families would sometimes follow, their grief considered part of the offering. The child would be laid across the stone as priests chanted, their small hands clutching corn husk dolls, an eerie parallel to the maze that desperately needed rain. Then came the act itself, not a blade but water. Some were drowned in sacred springs, their final breaths bubbling upward as prayers. Others had their throats slit so their blood could mix with water in ceremonial bowls, a gruesome marriage of elements. Archaeologists working at Templo Mayor uncovered a chamber that stopped them mid-dig, dozens of tiny skeletons, each with jade beads placed carefully in their mouths. The beads weren't just decoration, they were currency for the afterlife, a way to pay Tlaloc's toll. Some skulls showed signs of prolonged crying before death, possibly induced by priests rubbing chilly smoke into their eyes to ensure tears fell. Imagine the scene, a procession of weeping children, their sobs echoing off temple walls as clouds gathered overhead. For the Aztecs, this wasn't cruelty, it was a sacred equation. No tears meant no rain meant famine, death, the collapse of everything. Yet there's a haunting duality here. These children were often treated as divine guests in their final days, fed luxurious foods adorned with gold and feathers. Their deaths were framed as transformations, not endings, a belief that they would live forever in Tlalocan, a paradise of eternal spring. Modern excavations even reveal some child remains with healed fractures, suggesting they were cared for years before being chosen. This ritual wasn't just about fear, it was about a desperate love for the land, a willingness to give what was most precious to keep the world alive. The same hands that held these children as they drowned also cradled them in life, blurring the line between murder and mercy in ways that still unsettle us today. The selection process for Tlaloc's sacrifices was as precise as it was chilling. Priests scoured villages for children bearing the god's mark, those with two cowlicks in their hair or distinctive birthmarks said to resemble raindrops. These weren't arbitrary choices. The Aztecs believed these physical signs marked the children as Tlaloc's chosen vessels, conduits between the human world and the realm of storms. Spanish chronicler Diego de Ron recorded parents dressing their selected children in fine cotton and painting their faces with blue stripes, the color of rushing water, knowing what fate awaited them. Some families even sought this horrific honor, believing their child's sacrifice would bring prosperity to their entire lineage. As drought seasons stretched longer, the rituals grew more desperate. Archaeologists examining child remains at Tlaloc shrines found traces of pulque, a fermented agave drink, in their bones. This wasn't accidental. Parents would sometimes administer the intoxicant in their final hours, not to rebel against the priest's will, but to ease their child's terror. Imagine the scene, a mother humming lullabies while spooning the syrupy liquid between her child's lips, the bittersweet act of making death merciful while preparing them for divine service. The pulque's effects created a surreal juxtaposition, children giggling drowsily as they were carried up temple steps, their confusion softening the horror of what came next. Recent discoveries at the Templo Mayor complex revealed something even more unsettling. Among the usual grave offerings of jade beads and ceramic frogs, Tlaloc's sacred animal, researchers found tiny fingerprints pressed into lumps of uncooked copal resin. These appear to be the last playful imprints of children given the aromatic substance as a distraction before the ritual. The resin never hardened, preserved forever in the moment before their deaths. The aftermath of these sacrifices followed an eerie pattern. Witnesses reported storms often broke within days of the ceremonies, the rains arriving with such sudden violence they were seen as the children's spirits returning. This apparent confirmation of the ritual's effectiveness only deepened the cycle, making each subsequent drought trigger more fervent devotion to the practice. Modern meteorologists note these storms likely coincided with seasonal weather patterns the Aztecs had observed for generations, their rituals timed with uncanny accuracy to natural phenomena they didn't fully understand, but had learned to anticipate through centuries of careful observation. What emerges isn't just a story of blind cruelty, but of a civilization trapped in a devastating feedback loop. The more they sacrificed, the more the rains seemed to prove the gods' approval. The more the rains came, the harder it became to abandon the practice during future droughts. Each successful rainfall etched the ritual deeper into cultural memory, until the unthinkable became tradition, and tradition became necessity. The children's bones tell this story too. Their teeth often show signs of previous malnutrition, suggesting some were sacrificed during famines caused by the very droughts they died to end. A tragic circle where hunger birthed devotion, devotion demanded sacrifice, and sacrifice temporarily stayed the hunger, until the dry winds returned and the cycle began anew. For 360 days he lived like a god among men. Chosen from among the finest war captives, his body flawless, his voice like music, this youth would spend an entire year clothed in gold and quetzal feathers, smoking fragrant tobacco from pipes of polished jade. The Toxcatl festival wasn't just a sacrifice, it was the most elaborate role play in history, where a mortal became the living avatar of Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, god of night and sorcery. Crowds parted as he walked through Tenochtitlan, flutes strapped to his belt, for music was sacred to the god, priests attending his every need. He was taught to speak like nobility, to move with celestial grace. But this divinity had an expiration date, one that ticked closer with every feast, every adoring glance. The final 20 days were a surreal countdown. 4 wives representing goddesses joined him in an opulent palace, their days filled with banquets and sacred dances. Yet as the festival reached its climax, something shifted. The priests would lead him to a small, unadorned canoe, stripping away his jewels one by one as they rowed across Lake Texcoco. By the time they reached the shore, he was naked but for a single shell bracelet, his divine role already slipping away like sand through fingers. The final act was almost tender. Ascending the pyramid steps, he'd break one of his flutes on each stair, the sound dying step by step until he reached the summit. There, with practiced efficiency, the priests would open his chest, not roughly, but with a reverence reserved for handling something holy. His heart, still warm, was held toward the setting sun as if returning a borrowed treasure. What's most unsettling isn't the brutality, but the intimacy of it all. Unlike other sacrifices where victims were bound, this young man walked willingly to his death, often smiling according to Spanish accounts. Modern historians speculate he may have been drugged with sacred mushrooms or morning glory seeds, substances known to induce euphoria and detachment. But there's another layer. The Aztecs believed his spirit didn't die but merged with Tezcatlipoca himself. The very flute fragments left on the stairs were collected as relics, believed to carry echoes of that transformation. Archaeologists have unearthed evidence of this ritual's psychological complexity. At the base of the Templo Mayor, they found a cache of shattered flutes alongside tiny gold bells, likely from the god impersonator's costume. The arrangement suggests a deliberate dismantling of identity. Music silenced, finery discarded, the mortal shell emptied to make room for the divine. Even the timing was precise. The sacrifice coincided with the rainy season's arrival, symbolizing Tezcatlipoca's role as a god of cyclical change. One life ended so the skies might open, the earth drink, the world renew. This ritual forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about consent and brainwashing. Was this youth truly willing, or had a year of deification warped his perception? Spanish friars wrote of previous impersonators calmly training their replacements, instructing them in sacred gestures like actors passing on a role. Perhaps the most haunting detail comes from a Nahuatl poem describing the ritual. He goes singing, he goes scattering flowers, his heart blooms as he walks. In the Aztec worldview, this wasn't murder. It was the ultimate promotion, a mortal's fleeting chance to step into the sandals of a god before vanishing into legend. The ball court wasn't just a place for sport, it was a portal to the underworld, where the thump of rubber against stone echoed like a heartbeat from Xibalba itself. The sacred game of Ullamalistli was no casual pastime. It was cosmic theater, a reenactment of the gods' eternal struggle between light and darkness. But beneath the spectacle of athletes hurling themselves across the court to keep a heavy rubber ball aloft lay a grisly truth. The stakes were life and death. Captives and warriors alike played with their fates balanced on a knife's edge, knowing the final whistle might be the last sound they ever heard. Unlike modern competitions where victory brings trophies, in the Aztec world, triumph could be just as deadly as defeat. Some matches ended with the winning team offering themselves for sacrifice, a twist that baffled Spanish observers. This wasn't mere brutality, it was the ultimate honor. To die on the ball court was to follow in the footsteps of the hero twins from Maya and Aztec mythology, who outwitted the lords of death through a legendary game. The losers, when they weren't spared, faced a more pragmatic fate. Their skulls would join the chilling architecture of the Tz'ampantli, the great skull racks that loomed over every ceremonial center. Imagine walking through Tenochtitlan's central plaza, where row upon row of hollow-eyed skulls stared down from wooden beams. Spanish accounts describe these structures as towering walls of souls, some holding thousands of craniums cemented together with lime mortar. But these weren't just warnings or trophies, they were living libraries of spiritual energy. The Aztecs believed the Tz'ampantli trapped the sacrificial victim's life force, releasing it slowly like time-released prayers to nourish the gods. Recent excavations reveal how meticulously these displays were maintained. Skulls drilled with holes on either side to be threaded onto poles, arranged by age and status, some even painted with ochre or adorned with precious stones. One particularly macabre discovery at the Templo Maya shows how the ritual evolved over time. Early Tz'ampantli contained mostly male skulls, warriors and ball players, but later layers include increasing numbers of women and children, suggesting droughts or famines may have escalated the need for sacrifices across all sectors of society. Forensic analysis reveals another grim detail. Many skulls show signs of healing around the drill holes, proving some victims lived for months after being captured before meeting their end on the ball court or altar. The game itself was laden with symbolism that made these sacrifices inevitable. The rubber ball represented the sun, its movement across the court mirroring the celestial journey that required constant bloodshed to continue. Players wore padded belts studded with obsidian shards not just for protection, but to draw blood during dives and falls, turning every match into a miniature blood offering. Some courts were even built with stone rings high on the walls. Scoring a goal through one was so rare it often triggered immediate sacrifices in celebration. What's most striking is how this violence coexisted with sophisticated strategy. The Aztecs kept detailed records of player statistics, developed complex passing techniques, and even had referees who enforced rules about knee touches and ball handling. It was a fully realized sport, complete with devoted fans and heated rivalries, but one where the final score could determine who walked away and who ascended the pyramid steps. This duality captures the Aztec worldview perfectly. A civilization that could chart Venus's retrograde motion with pinpoint accuracy, yet believed the cosmos demanded a steady diet of screams to keep turning. The ball game wasn't just sport or sacrifice, it was the universe in miniature, played out on a court of polished stone where every bounce held the weight of eternity. The great Xipe of Tenochtitlan wasn't just a display. It was a living, breathing monument to the Aztec understanding of cosmic debt. When Spanish conquistadors first entered the city's sacred precinct, they froze at the sight of it. A towering latticework of wooden beams stretching longer than a football field, each pole threaded with human skulls staring blankly into the plaza below. Chronicler Andrés de Tapia claimed he tried counting them but gave up after estimating 80,000 empty eye sockets silently judging him. Modern archaeologists confirmed his terror wasn't exaggerated. Recent excavations near Mexico City's Metropolitan Cathedral uncovered a circular section of the structure containing 676 carefully arranged craniums, some still bearing the marks of obsidian blades and ceremonial paint. Forensic anthropologists working at the site made an unsettling discovery. These weren't just warriors' skulls. The collection included women, children, even infants, their fragile bones intermingled with those of battle-hardened soldiers. Analysis of teeth and bone density revealed victims came from every corner of Mesoamerica: Maya traders, Huastec farmers, Purepecha artisans. This was no haphazard pile of trophies, but a meticulously organized archive of sacrifice, each skull positioned based on origin, age, and time of offering. Some showed signs of trepanation, holes drilled while the person still lived, possibly to drain blood for ceremonial use before their eventual decapitation. Spanish accounts describe the Xipe as reeking of decay, but new evidence suggests the Aztecs went to great lengths to preserve their macabre monument. Residue tests reveal they regularly coated the skulls in lime powder, both to slow decomposition and to make them gleam white in sunlight, a chilling visual echo of their belief that bones held the seeds of rebirth. Even more startling was the realization that skulls weren't displayed indefinitely. After about a year, many were carefully removed to make room for new arrivals, their faces transformed into masks or mortar ingredients for temple renovations. To the Aztecs, this wasn't desecration but recycling. Every particle of a sacrificed individual continued serving the gods in some form. The most poignant discovery came from studying the skull's positioning. Rather than facing outward to intimidate enemies as previously assumed, forensic reconstruction shows they were angled upward toward the path of the sun. This alignment transformed the Xipe into a sort of grotesque sundial, its shadows marking sacred hours when priests would perform rituals at its base. On equinoxes, the structure cast a spine-like shadow stretching directly toward the temple of Huitzilopochtli, visually linking sacrifice to solar worship. Modern technology has peeled back even more layers of this gruesome practice. Three-dimensional scanning revealed tiny notches on many skulls, barely visible tally marks, tracking how many days each victim was paraded through the city before execution. Some craniums had been repeatedly painted and repainted, suggesting they were used in multiple ceremonies across generations. A few even contained traces of hallucinogenic compounds, hinting at ceremonies where priests or spectators ingested substances to commune with the spirits trapped within the bone. What emerges from these findings is a complex picture far beyond simple barbarism. The Xipe functioned as a spiritual battery in Aztec cosmology, a place where the energy of sacrificed souls could be stored and ritually tapped. Victim identities mattered less than their collective power. Whether warrior or child, each skull became a drop in an ocean of divine sustenance. Recent isotopic analysis proves some victims were fed special diets for months before death, their bodies literally fattened like ritual livestock to increase the offering's potency. Perhaps most chilling is how the structure evolved over time. Early versions contained mostly enemy warriors, but as droughts and famines increased in the 15th century, the skulls of slaves and even Aztec commoners began appearing. By the time Cortés arrived, the Xipe had become a desperate plea carved in bone, a civilization trying to stave off collapse by offering fragments of itself to gods who seemed increasingly hungry. The very scale of the monument, which once awed the Spanish into silence, may have been the Aztecs' undoing, a spiraling demand for sacrifices that no empire could sustain forever. Yet for all its horror, the T's apparently held a terrible logic. If the universe truly ran on blood, then this was simply the price of existence, paid in skulls instead of coin. The Atamalcualistly feast wasn't about indulgence, it was starvation as sacrament, a grueling 8-day marathon of deprivation that transformed priests into living vessels for the divine. While most civilizations celebrated harvests with abundance, the Aztecs marked the season by refusing to eat, their empty stomachs a silent prayer to Tlaloc, the capricious rain god. But the climax of this ritual held a paradox so strange it baffled Spanish chroniclers. After days without food, priests would gather at lakeshore altars to feast on water. Not just any water, this was ceremonial broth laced with their own blood, drawn through agonizing acts of self-piercing with Magi spines. Imagine the scene: barefoot priests, their ribs visible beneath ritual paint, kneeling at the water's edge as dawn broke over Lake Texcoco. Each man carried a bundle of razor-sharp Magi spines, not weapons but sacred utensils. One by one, they'd drive these spines through their tongues, earlobes, or genitals, letting crimson droplets fall into clay bowls floating on the lake's surface. The blood didn't dissipate, it swirled atop the water like liquid embroidery, forming what the Aztecs called water tamales, symbolic offerings that mirrored the real tamales forbidden during the fast. This wasn't mere theater. The priests believed their blood carried Chalchihuatl, the divine energy found in jade and precious waters, and by mixing it with the lake, they were returning life to its source. Archaeologists studying offerings dredged from the lakebed found traces of this ritual frozen in time: ceramic bowls stained with hemoglobin alongside spent Magi spines, their tips still bearing microscopic flecks of skin and blood. But the most revealing discovery came from analyzing the priests' skeletal remains. Many showed repetitive stress injuries in their wrists and fingers, evidence of years of ritual bloodletting. Their bones told a story of devotion that went far deeper than ceremony. This was a lifestyle, a daily dialogue with the gods written in scars. The ritual's timing reveals its true purpose. Atamalcualistly coincided with the late dry season, when shrinking lakes exposed cracked earth and desperate fish. By sacrificing their strength during this precarious time, the priests weren't just asking for rain, they were embodying the land's thirst, creating a sympathetic link between human suffering and the earth's need. Spanish accounts describe participants hallucinating from hunger by the final days, their visions of water spirits seen not as breakdowns but as sacred encounters. Modern scholars note the Magi spines may have carried psychoactive compounds, turning self-harm into a doorway for transcendence. What seems like madness held deep ecological wisdom. The Magi plant itself was central to Aztec survival. Its fibers clothed them, its sap became pulque, its needles drew blood to feed the gods. Even the act of bloodletting mirrored agricultural cycles. Just as Magi leaves regenerate after harvest, so too would the priest's blood replenish, creating a sustainable cycle of sacrifice. The water tamales were more than metaphor. They were miniature ecosystems where human biology met hydrology, each droplet a plea for balance in a world perpetually on the edge of drought. By the ritual's end, when priests finally broke their fast with actual tamales, the contrast was intentional, a reminder that every bite of food, every sip of water came at a cost. This wasn't just spirituality, it was the Aztec understanding of thermodynamics applied to the soul. Energy couldn't be created or destroyed, only transformed, traded, and sometimes spilled across the surface of a waiting lake. The bones didn't stay buried long in Michelhuatantli, the Aztec festival where death wasn't an end but an invitation to dance. Imagine the scene, families gathering at gravesides as dusk fell, not with tears but with bundles of bright fabrics and bowls of pungent copal resin. They'd exhume their ancestors with tender care, brushing dirt from sunken eye sockets and wrapping brittle spines in fresh cotton. These weren't morbid acts, they were reunions. For 20 days each year, the veil between worlds grew thin enough to touch, and the Aztecs seized that chance with startling intimacy. Unlike modern Dia de los Muertos, where sugar skulls and marigolds honor the departed from a distance, Huitotli demanded physical closeness. Spanish friars wrote of witnessing processions where the dead were propped upright, their jawbones wired shut with gold threads to keep them speaking through the clatter of teeth as relatives carried them through the streets. The corpses weren't just displayed, they were active participants. Families would dress them in elaborate huipil tunics, adorn them with jade beads, even seat them at banquet tables where the living fed them symbolic morsels of tamales and pulque. Some accounts describe dancers tying cords around the corpses' wrists, pulling them into macabre waltzes where flesh and bones swayed together under the moonlight. Archaeologists have uncovered traces of these rituals in surprising places. Beneath the foundations of houses in Tlaloc, they've found secondary burials, carefully rearranged bones with fibers from brightly dyed cloth still clinging to them, proof that these weren't one-time ceremonies but cyclical traditions. Forensic analysis reveals something even more remarkable. Many skeletons show polished wear patterns on joints, evidence that they were repeatedly handled, posed, and rewrapped over generations. The Aztecs weren't just remembering their dead, they were keeping them present, their bones becoming heirlooms more alive than any portrait. The festival's climax held a beautiful contradiction. After weeks of feasting and dancing with their ancestors, families would return the adorned corpses to their graves, but not before breaking the bones. This wasn't desecration, it was liberation. By snapping femurs and cracking ribs, they believed they released the deceased's tonali, their life force, to journey fully into the afterlife. Modern reconstructions show the breaks were precise, often made with ritual obsidian blades at specific points corresponding to energy meridians in Aztec anatomy. The same hands that lovingly dressed skeletons would then fracture them with surgical care, a final act of devotion masquerading as violence. Some scholars argue this practice explains the eerie similarities between Huitotli and today's Dia de los Muertos. The Spanish tried to eradicate the festival, horrified by its visceral physicality, but indigenous communities adapted. Skulls became sugar instead of bone, ofrendas replaced exhumations, and the dancing dead now exist in effigy rather than flesh. Yet traces remain, the Pan de Muertos bone-shaped decorations, the way some families still whisper to photographs as if expecting answers. What the conquistadors dismissed as pagan horror was, in truth, one of history's most profound expressions of love, the refusal to let death sever connection, even if it meant digging through earth to hold someone one last time. Perhaps the most poignant legacy lies in the festival's timing. Huitotli coincided with the maize harvest when the first ears were plump with kernels like teeth in a grinning jaw. The Aztecs saw no contradiction in celebrating life and death in the same breath. To them, every harvest was a kind of resurrection, proof that endings could nourish new beginnings. As modern celebrants paint their faces as skulls each November, they unknowingly echo an ancient truth: the dead never really leave us. They simply change form like seeds in the soil, waiting to be called back for one more dance. The nobles' bloodletting ceremonies were spectacles of endurance, where status wasn't measured by wealth alone, but by one's capacity to endure pain for the gods. Imagine the scene in a royal courtyard, the air thick with incense, drums throbbing like a pulse, as a high-ranking lord knelt before a carved jaguar altar. His attendants would present an obsidian blade so sharp its edge shimmered like water, its surface engraved with sacred glyphs. Without flinching, he'd draw the blade through his tongue in one smooth motion, letting the blood drip onto strips of bark paper that would later be burned as divine incense. This wasn't punishment, it was privilege. While commoners might sacrifice animals, the elite offered something far more precious, their own life force dropped by crimson drop. Archaeologists have uncovered these ritual bloodletters in the tombs of Aztec nobility, slender obsidian blades with handles wrapped in gold wire or turquoise mosaic. One particularly ornate example from Texcoco's Royal Cemetery showed microscopic traces of human blood, pulp, and jade dust in its crevices, suggesting it was used in multiple ceremonies. The blades weren't mere tools, they were heirlooms passed down through generations like crown jewels. Spanish chronicler Bernardino de Sahagún described how some nobles would compete in bloodletting contests, seeing who could draw the most blood before collapsing. The most devout might thread ropes of thorns through their tongues, leaving them dangling like grotesque necklaces until the next ceremony. What makes these rituals even more astonishing is the medical precision behind them. Forensic analysis of noble remains shows carefully placed puncture wounds along the earlobes, genitals, and calves, never arteries, never fatal. Aztec physicians apparently knew exactly where to cut for maximum blood flow with minimum risk. Some noblewomen's skeletons reveal clusters of healed perforations along the inner thighs, suggesting they participated in moon cycle bloodlettings tied to fertility rites. The pain was real, but so was the payoff. These acts brought political power, divine favor, and a guarantee of preferential treatment in the afterlife. The blood itself was treated as liquid gold. Attendants would catch the drops in ceremonial bowls shaped like open flowers, mixing them with copal resin to create a paste the Aztecs called divine mortar. This substance was then smeared on temple walls or cast into sacred fires, where the sizzle and smoke were believed to carry prayers directly to the gods. Some murals at Teotihuacan depict nobles bleeding into vessels shaped like corn cobs, a direct symbolic link between human sacrifice and agricultural fertility. But perhaps the most revealing aspect lies in what happened after the bloodletting. Noble participants weren't left to heal unaided. Excavations at elite palace sites have turned up small clay pots containing ointments made from crushed megi spines, honey, and ground obsidian powder, an ancient antiseptic cocktail. Others held hallucinogenic mushrooms or fermented balshay bark, substances likely used to induce visions during the blood loss. This wasn't just masochism, it was a carefully choreographed transformation where pain became a gateway to the divine. The Spanish found these practices particularly abhorrent, but modern hematology reveals their unintended wisdom. Regular, controlled bloodletting can temporarily boost endorphins and induce euphoria, effects the Aztecs interpreted as spiritual communion. Some researchers even speculate that iron-deficient nobles may have entered trance states more easily, making them ideal conduits for messages from the gods. True or not, one thing is certain. In the Aztec world, power flowed two ways, through veins and through bloodletters alike. The obsidian blades used in Aztec rituals weren't just tools. They were born from fire and prayer, crafted with a reverence that blurred the line between weapon and relic. Deep in the workshops of Tenochtitlan, master flintknappers worked in near darkness, their hands guided by decades of muscle memory as they struck volcanic glass with antler hammers. Each fracture had to be perfect, edges sharp enough to split a hair lengthwise, yet balanced for the priest's grip during the delicate act of heart extraction. Spanish chroniclers described the sound of their labor, a rhythmic tink-tink like distant rainfall as artisans shaped the black stone into curves mimicking the crescent moon, a nod to Coyolxauhqui, the dismembered moon goddess whose sacrifice mirrored their work. What made these blades sacred wasn't just their sharpness, but their origin. The finest obsidian came from the holy mines of Pachuca, where priests performed purification rites before extraction. Workers entering the tunnels had to undergo 40 days of celibacy and fasting, believing the stone absorbed spiritual impurity. Modern geologists confirm the Pachuca veins produced a unique volcanic glass with fewer bubbles and fractures, material so pristine it could hold an edge sharper than surgical steel. Archaeologists have found caches of these blades wrapped in jaguar skins, their surfaces still bearing fingerprints in resin where priests anointed them with mixtures of crushed emerald and human ash. The bloodletting specialists themselves were a caste apart. Trained from childhood, these Tlaloc heart-takers understood anatomy with startling precision. Spanish accounts describe their rituals. Before a sacrifice, they'd drink mixtures containing psilocybin mushrooms to steady their hands, then recite spells from the Florentine Codex as they position the blade over a victim's fifth left rib. Their skill was measured not by speed but by control. A perfect cut would sever the heart's aorta while leaving the organ intact for lifting. Forensic analysis of sacrificial remains confirms their expertise. Rib cages show clean, angled incisions suggesting the blade entered at a precise 15-degree tilt to avoid the sternum. Ceremonial bowls used to catch the blood were no less sacred. Crafted from the skulls of previous sacrificial victims, these Cuauhxicalli vessels were lined with gold leaf to prevent absorption, turning each into a mirror that reflected the dying victim's face back to the gods. Recent chemical analysis of residue inside these bowls reveals layers of hemoglobin mixed with yotli, an aromatic herb burned to carry the scent of blood skyward. Some vessels even had spouts shaped like serpent tongues, allowing priests to pour offerings directly onto temple statues in a gruesome baptism. The most chilling discovery came from a buried workshop near the Templo Mayor. Here, researchers found unfinished blades alongside the skeletons of their makers' flint knappers, buried with their tools still clutched in skeletal hands. Isotope testing revealed these artisans had been fed a diet rich in amaranth and human flesh, likely from sacrifices they'd helped facilitate. In death as in life, they served the blade. This wasn't mere craftsmanship. It was a sacred covenant where every cut in stone mirrored the cuts on living flesh, and every drop of blood became ink in the Aztecs' unwritten pact with the divine. The gladiatorial sacrifices of the Aztecs turned war into theater and death into an art form. Captured warriors, often kings and champions from rival city-states, were given one last chance to fight not for survival but for honor. Tied to a massive circular stone called the Temelacatl by a rope just long enough to move, they faced a rotating gauntlet of Aztec jaguar and eagle warriors armed with obsidian clubs. The crowd didn't cheer for blood, they cheered for skill as the doomed combatant parried and struck with the desperation of a man who knew his heart would feed the sun god by dusk. Spanish accounts describe some prisoners fighting so brilliantly they were offered mercy only to refuse, choosing ritual death over disgrace. The weapons themselves were part of the sacred deception. Aztec warriors wielded macuahuitl swords studded with razor-sharp obsidian, but the captive's club was edged with feathers instead of blades, a symbolic handicap that turned the fight into a dance of dominance. Archaeologists examining Temelacatl stones have found grooves worn into their surfaces from countless circling feet, and darker patches where blood pooled after the final blow. What looked like sport was cosmology in motion. The circular stone represented the cyclical nature of time, the rope the umbilical cord of existence, and the combatant's struggle mirrored the eternal battle between day and night. When the warrior finally fell, the true ritual began. Priests would carry his still-twitching body up the pyramid steps to the Cuauhxicalli, an eagle-shaped vessel carved from volcanic stone. These weren't mere bowls, their curved interiors were engineered with shocking precision. Modern 3D scans reveal subtle ridges that channeled blood toward the eagle's gaping beak, which funneled the liquid into ceremonial pipes feeding the temple foundations. The most chilling examples even have internal filters mesh-like carvings that caught chunks of heart tissue so only purified blood flowed downward. The heart extraction itself was a gruesome ballet. Unlike standard sacrifices where priests worked quickly, these ceremonies slowed the moment of death. The victim's chest was opened while he still breathed, his heart carefully separated from arteries before being lifted, still pulsing, toward the sun. Spanish friar Diego de Ron recorded that some victims managed to speak during this ordeal, their diaphragms pushing air through collapsing lungs to utter final challenges or prayers. Forensic analysis of cooxycale residue shows traces of adrenaline and cortisol mixed with blood, proof these men died fully conscious, their bodies flooded with fight chemicals until the very last second. What happened afterward reveals the ritual's deeper purpose. The warrior's skull was often given to his captor as a trophy, but not before being boiled clean and decorated with turquoise mosaic. These weren't mere battle souvenirs, they became sacred objects passed down through generations, believed to house the dead warrior's bravery. Some excavated examples still bear tooth marks along the edges, evidence that descendants would ritually feed them during ceremonies, pressing morsels of ceremonial bread between the teeth to nourish the spirit within. The ultimate fate of the body carried its own symbolism. Unlike common victims whose remains were tossed down temple steps, these honored warriors were carefully butchered. Their flesh became the centerpiece of a ceremonial stew fed to nobility, not out of savagery, but because consuming courage was thought to transfer its essence. Their bones, however, received startling care. Recent excavations near the Templo Mayor uncovered bundles of warrior remains wrapped in jaguar pelts, each femur painted with red ochre and placed alongside miniature weapons. These weren't discarded corpses, they were venerated relics treated with more respect in death than many Aztecs received in life. This ritual forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about honor and brutality. The same culture that perfected this orchestrated slaughter also held poetic contests where warriors composed verses about fleeting beauty. Their concept of heroism wasn't about winning, but about how one faced the inevitable, a philosophy that turned even victims into unwilling collaborators in their own myth-making. The Temalacatl stones still exist today, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of weather and wonder. Run your fingers along those grooves, and you're touching the last footprints of men who walked in circles toward gods they believed were watching, and might have been right all along. The priests moved through the streets like living corpses, their borrowed skins sagging with each step as putrid fluids dripped onto the temple stones below. This was the culmination of the Tlaloc festival, 20 days spent dressed in another man's flesh. The flayed epidermis of sacrificed warriors stretched tight over their bodies until it fused to their own. Spanish soldier Bernal Díaz del Castillo wrote of the unbearable stench that hung over Tenochtitlan during these ceremonies, comparing it to a slaughterhouse left too long in the sun. But for the Aztecs, this decomposition wasn't repulsive. It was sacred alchemy, the visible transformation of death into life. The process began with warriors captured in battle, chosen for their physical perfection. After their hearts were offered to Xipe Totec, the flayed lord, priests performed a ritual so precise it rivaled modern surgery. Using obsidian blades sharper than steel, they made a single incision down the back, then peeled the skin away in one piece like removing a glove. The fresh hide, still warm, was immediately given to a priest who wriggled into it through the back slit, the empty face flopping over his own until secured with cords. For the next cycle of the moon, this living effigy would dance through the city, the skin tightening as it dried, cracking as it rotted, until it hung in tattered ribbons. What seems like macabre theater held profound agricultural symbolism. Just as maize sheds its outer husk to reveal edible kernels, the priests believed their rotting costumes mirrored the earth's cycles of renewal. Murals at Teopanzolco show these skin dancers scattering seeds between their steps, their decaying flesh fertilizing the soil with each drop of liquefied tissue. Modern archaeologists have found pits near temple complexes filled with masses of decomposed skin fragments, mixed with sprouted corn kernels, evidence that this was more than metaphor. The Aztecs literally planted death to harvest life. The psychological toll on the priests was staggering. medical analysis of their remains reveals chronic infections from prolonged contact with rotting flesh, including bone lesions caused by septicemia. Yet they endured, believing their suffering nourished the gods. Some accounts describe priests going mad from the constant itch of decaying skin, their fingers wearing down to nubs from scratching at their living burial shrouds. The final removal was its own ordeal. Peeling away the putrid second skin often took layers of their own flesh with it, leaving raw muscle exposed. Spanish friars wrote of healers applying salves made from maguey sap and ground jade to these wounds, turning the priests' bodies into living maps of sacrifice. Perhaps most unsettling are the surviving Xipe Totec statues, their stone surfaces carved with disturbing accuracy to mimic flayed flesh. Close examination reveals fingernails still attached at the wrists, the hollow eye sockets sagging as if mid-decay. Some even have movable arms, allowing priests to dress them in actual human skins during ceremonies. These weren't static idols. They were participants in the ritual, their stone mouths stuffed with maize during planting season to feed on the energy of the skins. The ceremony's end brought a surreal reversal. When the last shreds of skin fell away, priests would collect the fragments and stuff them into ceramic jars shaped like smiling faces. These vessels, recently excavated near El Tepestico, still contain leathery scraps of epidermis with tattooed battle marks visible after 5 centuries. The jars were then smashed against temple walls, their contents splattering like overripe fruit, a final act of transformation ensuring the warrior's essence entered the spiritual realm. What lingers today isn't just the horror, but the ritual's eerie resonance with modern science. The Aztecs didn't know about nitrogen cycles or decomposition microbiology, yet their skin dancers instinctively mirrored nature's processes. Every rotting step released nutrients into the earth. Every drop of liquefied flesh carried the warrior's energy back into the ecosystem. In their grotesque ballet, they anticipated concepts we now call bioregeneration, the understanding that death feeds life in an endless loop. The stench that repulsed the Spanish was the scent of the earth breathing, and the skin dancers were its unwilling midwives. The harvest moon hung low over the fields when the woman who would become a goddess climbed the temple steps. Chosen for her resemblance to Chicomacoatl, the 7-serpent corn deity, she had spent 40 days living as divine royalty, her body painted yellow like ripe maize, her hair braided with husks. Every meal she ate was sacred, blue tortillas shaped like ears of corn, amaranth cakes sweetened with honey, pulque fermented to golden perfection. To onlookers, she wasn't human anymore. She was the living embodiment of the harvest itself, plump and ready for reaping. The ceremony began with her dancing through the fields, scattering kernels from a ceremonial basket while priests chanted rhythms that mimicked rain. Crowds followed, their hands outstretched to brush her limbs as if touching living fertility. As night fell, the mood shifted. Bound in ropes dyed cornflower blue, she was led to a stone carved with grooves, not to lie upon but to kneel before, her neck arched over a concave depression. The priest's blade wasn't obsidian this time, but flint, its jagged edge symbolizing the teeth of the earth ready to consume its bounty. What happened next was both brutal and eerily methodical. The beheading wasn't a single strike, but a sawing motion meant to mimic the harvest sickle's slow cut through a cornstalk. Spanish chroniclers noted how the woman's body remained eerily still, her trained acceptance a testament to the psychological preparation undertaken during her divine month. As her head tumbled into a woven basket lined with corn silk, attendants caught the arterial spray in clay pots shaped like blooming squash flowers, every drop saved to anoint the next season's seeds. But the ritual's true complexity lay in what followed. The body was carefully butchered, its limbs disarticulated at the joints like ears of corn snapped from their stalks. Her arms and legs were roasted with chilies and amaranth, then distributed among the nobility in a feast that blurred the line between cannibalism and communion. This wasn't random violence, it was symbolic recycling. By consuming her flesh, especially the muscle-rich thighs, the Aztec elite believed they absorbed the goddess's strength to fuel future harvests. Forensic analysis of cooking vessels from this ritual reveals a surprising detail. The meat was always boiled first, possibly to remove identifiable human features before roasting, making the act more palatable psychologically. The head received special treatment. Skull masks found at the Templo Mayor site show traces of gilded paint and turquoise mosaic, suggesting the victim's cranium was transformed into a ritual object. Some still bear tooth marks around the eye sockets, evidence that priests may have worn them during planting ceremonies, biting down to release the goddess's power into the soil. The jawbones, however, were ground into powder and mixed with cornmeal, creating a dough used to shape miniature effigies of Xipe. These figurines were buried at field boundaries, their presence meant to guard the crops like spiritual scarecrows. What seems like senseless brutality held deep agricultural logic. The woman's sacrifice coincided with the autumnal equinox, when the balance between light and darkness mirrored the Aztec belief in cyclical renewal. Her death wasn't an end, but a transformation, like seeds buried in winter only to rise again as green shoots. Modern botanists note the ritual's timing was impeccable. The blood used to bless the fields contained nitrogen-rich compounds that actually enriched the soil, while the buried effigies may have functioned as primitive nutrient reservoirs, slowly releasing minerals as they decomposed. The most haunting legacy of this ritual lies in its echoes today. In remote Mexican villages, harvest festivals still feature effigies made from corn husks that are ritually beheaded before being scattered across fields. The ancient rite lives on, stripped of its human cost but retaining its core symbolism that life springs from sacrifice, and every meal we eat contains echoes of the divine. The crackle of sacred flames drowned out the screams as the victims of Xiuhcoatl's hunger writhed in the temple courtyard. This was no ordinary execution. The fire serpent demanded a slow, agonizing transformation, where flesh became smoke and bone turned to sacred powder. Chosen from among war captives and criminals, these sacrifices were tied to wooden frames shaped like the undulating body of Xiuhcoatl itself, their limbs arranged to mimic the serpent's coils. As priests lit the pyre beneath them, the crowd didn't look away. They chanted prayers timed to the victims' shrieks, believing each cry carried their own pleas skyward to the fiery deity. What set this ritual apart was its meticulous aftermath. Once the flames died down, priests sifted through the ashes with obsidian tweezers, collecting every fragment of charred bone and teeth. These remains weren't discarded. They were painstakingly ground into powder using volcanic stone mortars, mixed with resin from the copal tree, and pressed into small, cigar-shaped bundles called xumilpilli. Wrapped in layers of bark paper infused with crushed turquoise, each bundle represented a compacted soul, a portable piece of divine energy. Spanish chroniclers described seeing racks of these bundles in temple vaults, arranged like ammunition for spiritual warfare. Recent excavations near the Templo Mayor unearthed a cache of these xumilpilli, their contents remarkably preserved. Forensic analysis revealed something startling. The ash mixtures contained traces of hallucinogenic mushrooms and morning glory seeds. This suggests the bundles weren't just symbolic. They may have been ritually smoked during ceremonies, turning the victims' remains into psychoactive conduits between worlds. Imagine the scene, priests inhaling the essence of the sacrificed, their visions filled with fiery serpents coiling through the stars, the boundaries between pain and ecstasy blurring with every breath. The timing of these sacrifices reveals their cosmic significance. Xiuhcoatl wasn't just any fire spirit. It was the weapon wielded by Huitzilopochtli to banish darkness at the dawn of creation. By recreating this primordial battle through human combustion, the Aztecs believed they stoked the sun's furnace, ensuring it would rise again. Modern astronomers note the rituals peaked during solar eclipses, when the serpent of shadow threatened to swallow the sun whole. In those moments of celestial terror, the smoke of burning flesh became a desperate SOS signal to the gods, but the most haunting detail lies in the bundle's secondary use. During the new fire ceremony held every 52 years, these Zumulpilli were carefully unwrapped, their ashes mixed with the blood of fresh sacrifices to create a primordial paste. This substance was then smeared on newborn babies' foreheads and warriors' weapons, a grisly baptism linking each generation to those who burned before them. The same hands that tied victims to the pyre later cradled infants anointed with their remains, closing a loop where destruction and nurture were inseparable. To the Aztecs, fire wasn't just an element, it was a living, hungry thing that demanded constant feeding. Every charred skeleton, every ash bundle, every wisp of scented smoke was a down payment on another sunrise. The victims who perished screaming in Xucotl's embrace didn't just die. They became the sparks that kept the cosmic engine running, their agony transformed into the quiet miracle of dawn. The merchant's golden ornaments dragged him deeper into the black waters of Lake Texcoco, his silk robes billowing like a dying jellyfish as the current claimed its due. These weren't criminals or war captives. They were the wealthiest, most powerful traders in the Aztec Empire, men who commanded fleets of canoes laden with jade, cocoa beans, and quetzal feathers. Yet once every 52 years during the festival of Atlcahulo, their privilege became their death sentence. Bound hand and foot with ropes dyed the color of algae, they were cast alive into the lake as offerings to Tlaloc and Chalchutlecu, the water deities who controlled the lifeblood of commerce, rain, rivers, and the very lakes that bore their trade goods. What makes this ritual so chilling is the meticulous preparation that preceded it. Spanish chronicles describe how merchants underwent elaborate purification rites for 40 days before the sacrifice, bathing in sacred springs, eating only white maize cakes, and sleeping on mats woven from reeds that would later bind them. Their final feast wasn't a somber affair, but a lavish banquet where they were celebrated as living bridges between the human and divine. Murals at Tlaloc show these doomed traders painted blue like the gods they would soon join, their bodies adorned with jade beads that archaeologists later found scattered across lake beds, perfectly preserved in the anaerobic mud. The paradox was as deliberate as it was brutal. These merchants weren't victims of some jealous priesthood, they actively participated in their own selection, even competing for the honor through complex displays of wealth and piety. Excavations of merchant lodges reveal hidden shrines where candidates performed secret bloodletting ceremonies, slicing their tongues with stingray spines to prove their devotion. Their status didn't exempt them from sacrifice, it demanded it. In the Aztec worldview, the very prosperity that elevated these men made their life force more valuable as divine currency. Modern sonar scans of Lake Texcoco have revealed eerie clusters of skeletons still weighted down with copper anklets and traders' scales, their positions suggesting some struggled while others embraced their fate. One particularly haunting discovery was a merchant buried face down in the silt, his arms crossed not in restraint but in the traditional gesture of honorable surrender. Forensic analysis shows his stomach contained traces of chocolate mixed with psilocybin mushrooms, a sacred cocktail likely administered to ease his passage into the watery underworld. What's often overlooked is the ritual's deep economic symbolism. The ropes used to bind the merchants weren't ordinary twine, but repurposed measuring cords from their own market stalls, turning the tools of commerce into instruments of devotion. As they sank, attendants scattered cacao beans across the surface, a symbolic reimbursement to Tlaloc for the debt of rainfall that nourished their crops. Even the timing was calculated. Atlcahulo coincided with the dry season's peak, when receding waters exposed cracked lake beds like emptied coffers. Perhaps most revealing are the posthumous honors these merchants received. Unlike common sacrificial victims who vanished into anonymity, drowned traders were memorialized in painted codices as semi-divine figures. Their descendants inherited not just their wealth but their sacred status, forming a dynasty of privilege rooted in ancestral sacrifice. Some families even kept ceremonial dummies made from their relatives' hair and fingernails, dressing them in miniature merchant garb for annual rituals. This wasn't mindless cruelty, it was a brutal economic contract written in flesh and water. The same currents that carried Aztec trade canoes also carried their most successful traders into the depths, a cyclical exchange where prosperity flowed both ways. When modern fishermen on Lake Texcoco still pull up strange artifacts from the mud, they're touching the last remnants of men who understood the true price of abundance, that every drop of wealth must eventually return to the source. The Pochteca moved through foreign markets like shadows, their true purpose hidden beneath the clatter of trade goods and the haggling over jade and cocoa. These merchant spies were the Aztec Empire's silent architects of sacrifice, bartering not just for luxury items but for the most precious commodity of all, human flesh. Disguised as humble traders, they slipped into enemy territories, learning local dialects and customs while discreetly noting which villages had strong young warriors or noble-blooded captives worth acquiring. Some even wore the clothing of rival city-states, their true loyalties concealed behind carefully crafted personas. A casual exchange of Quetzal feathers might disguise negotiations for prisoners of war, the price paid not in gold but in obsidian blades or the promise of safe passage through Aztec lands. But their most chilling work began after sundown. Under the cloak of darkness, the Pochteca transformed from merchants into something far more sinister. Secret ceremonies in windowless chambers saw them donning the flayed skins of previous sacrificial victims, their faces hidden behind masks made from human scalp hair stitched together with sinew. Accounts from the Florentine Codex describe these midnight rituals where merchants inhaled hallucinogenic smoke from pipes carved from femur bones, their visions guiding them to future captives. They traded not just goods but in souls, marking targets with coded symbols painted in invisible plant dyes that only fellow Pochteca could decipher. Their dual role demanded a macabre balancing act. By day, these men were pillars of Aztec high society, their wealth evident in the jade plugs adorning their teeth and the cotton mantles dyed with rare purples. By night, they became conduits for divine hunger, procuring the human fuel that kept the empire's spiritual engines running. Spanish chronicler Bernardino de Sahagún recorded their eerie oath: "We are the hands that feed the gods, though they chew our fingers in gratitude." This wasn't metaphor. Excavations at merchant compounds reveal skeletons missing finger bones, likely self-amputated as offerings during clandestine rites. The risks were as extreme as the rewards. Captured Pochteca in enemy lands faced gruesome executions, their bodies dismembered and displayed as warnings. Yet the Aztec state incentivized this deadly work with unparalleled privileges. Successful merchant spies could own land, wear noble regalia, and even have their portraits painted in codices honors denied to commoners. Their greatest perquisite was disturbingly poetic. Any Pochteca who secured 20 sacrificial victims earned the right to be strangled rather than having his heart cut out if ever captured, a merciful death reserved for elites. Recent archaeological finds peel back another layer of their secretive world. At a buried Pochteca trading post near modern-day Veracruz, researchers uncovered a cache of ceramic figurines with hollow chambers in their torsos, miniature versions of the merchants themselves, designed to hold human finger bones and bloodletting spines. These weren't mere idols, they were ritual passports believed to protect the carriers during their dangerous missions. Chemical analysis revealed traces of human blood mixed with cacao inside some figurines, likely from ceremonies where merchants symbolically fed their miniature doubles before embarking on journeys. Perhaps most telling is how the Pochteca's legacy endured even after conquest. Spanish records note that some merchants continued their clandestine work under new masters, using Catholic saint statues with removable heads to hide tiny Xipe Totec effigies inside. The same networks that once smuggled captives for sacrifice later transported forbidden codices and ritual objects, proving that old habits and old gods die hard. In the end, the Pochteca weren't just traders or spies, but the connective tissue of an empire built on faith and force, their ledgers balanced in blood as much as in gold. The obsidian mirror gleamed in the torchlight, its surface swirling with more than just reflections. This was no ordinary looking glass, but a window to the spirit world. Priests of Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror god, would spend nights staring into these volcanic glass discs until their pupils swallowed the darkness whole. Spanish chroniclers wrote of shamans whispering to their own warped reflections as if holding conversation, their breath fogging the polished stone with each invocation. Modern archaeologists examining these mirrors under microscopes made a chilling discovery. Many contain nearly invisible etchings of faces along their edges, spirit guides carved so finely they only appear when the stone catches light at certain angles. The process began with 40 days of purification, no salt, no chili, no intimacy with women or men. The chosen diviner would then ingest a paste made from morning glory seeds and the powdered bones of previous seers, a psychedelic cocktail designed to dissolve the barrier between worlds. As the toxins took hold, attendants would place a child, usually between 5 and 7 years old, before the mirror, their wide eyes serving as living focal points for the visions. Accounts from the Florentine Codex describe how some children's pupils would expand unnaturally during these rites, their irises turning black as the obsidian itself, as if absorbing the priest's trance. The most powerful mirrors weren't just polished stone, they were composite creations, layered with sheets of gold, human fingernails, and ground magnetite that somehow enhanced their supernatural properties. Recent X-ray fluorescence studies reveal some mirrors contain trace amounts of mercury, likely added to create eerie, shimmering distortions. These weren't passive divination tools, they were technological marvels of spiritual engineering, their surfaces occasionally wiped with sacrificial blood to maintain their connection to the other side. When the visions came, they were seldom peaceful. Tezcatlipoca was a capricious god who spoke in riddles and demanded proof of devotion. Many divination sessions ended with the child's sacrifice, their throats slit so their blood could anoint the mirror's edge, their final breath fogging the glass as their spirit crossed over. Forensic analysis of excavation sites near mirror chambers reveals small, shallow pits filled with the remains of these children, their bones arranged in circular patterns mirroring the divination discs. Some skulls show signs of trepanation, holes carefully drilled to release vision vapors believed to linger in the brain after death. What makes these rituals particularly unsettling is their lingering influence. The smoking mirror cult didn't vanish with the Aztec Empire. Spanish Inquisition records describe colonial-era shamans still using obsidian mirrors to predict rebellions, some allegedly crafted from fragments of shattered temple artifacts. Even today, certain curanderos in rural Mexico keep the old traditions alive, whispering prayers over blackened glass as their ancestors once did. The mirrors endure as silent witnesses to a worldview where reality was always fluid, where the boundary between observer and observed could dissolve with the right combination of stone, sacrament, and sacrifice. Tezcatlipoca's greatest trick wasn't hiding the future in his mirror. It was convincing his priests that the visions they saw weren't hallucinations but reflections of deeper truths. When modern psychonauts experiment with similar psychedelics, they report seeing the same swirling patterns and shadowy figures the Aztecs documented centuries ago. The mirrors may have been windows, but what they revealed was perhaps never out there at all, but locked within the human mind all along, waiting for the right combination of darkness, devotion, and desperate curiosity to set it free. The victims stood strapped to wooden frames high above the gathered crowd, their limbs stretched into the shape of human stars against the dawn sky. This was no simple execution. It was celestial theater, a sacred reenactment of the moment when the god Mixcoatl pierced the heavens with his arrows, letting the first rains fall upon the earth. As the sun reached its zenith, archers clad in jaguar pelts took aim with arrows tipped not in lethal obsidian, but in thorns designed to wound without killing quickly. The first volley struck thighs and shoulders, drawing shrieks that echoed across the temple complex, each cry mimicking the thunder Mixcoatl was said to summon. The timing of these sacrifices wasn't arbitrary. They coincided with the first whispers of the rainy season, when the air grew heavy with unshed moisture and farmers eyed the brittle soil with growing desperation. Aztec astronomers tracked the movements of the constellation we now call Orion, believed to be Mixcoatl's celestial form, and scheduled the ritual for when its bow appeared most prominent in the night sky. Victims were selected with equal precision, warriors captured during the Flowery Wars, their vitality seen as a living metaphor for the Earth's latent fertility. Spanish chronicler Diego de Ron described how priests would collect the blood-drenched arrows after the ceremony, planting them in fields like macabre seeds to encourage crop growth. Modern excavations at Mixcoatl shrines reveal the grim engineering behind these rituals. The wooden frames weren't passive structures. They were designed with subtle inclines so blood would channel down grooves into ceremonial gutters below. Archaeologists have found networks of these channels leading to underground chambers lined with absorbent volcanic sand, where the sacred liquid was left to coagulate before being mixed with sprouted maize. The most chilling discovery came from analyzing the sand itself. Traces of nitrogen and iron match the nutritional profile of modern fertilizers, proving the Aztecs unknowingly created a potent agricultural supplement from human blood. The victim's suffering was prolonged by design. Archers avoided major arteries, targeting muscle tissue to maximize bleeding without rapid unconsciousness. Some frames were even equipped with rotating mechanisms, allowing priests to reposition the victims so fresh wounds could be opened as old ones clotted. Forensic analysis of recovered skeletons shows healed arrow marks alongside fatal ones, suggesting some survived multiple rituals before succumbing. This wasn't mere cruelty. It reflected the Aztec belief that suffering, like rain, needed to be steady and sustained to nourish properly. What happened after death reveals the ritual's deeper symbolism. Unlike most sacrificial victims whose bodies were discarded, these arrow beings received careful butchery. Their flesh was cut into strips and dried into jerky called Tlaloc, which was buried at the four corners of newly plowed fields. Spanish accounts mention farmers singing to these flesh strips as they placed them in the earth, addressing them as elder brothers who would persuade the soil to be fruitful. Recent soil studies in former Aztec farmlands show elevated phosphorus levels in these boundary areas, suggesting the practice had tangible agricultural benefits beyond spirituality. The final act blurred the line between horror and beauty. As dusk fell on the ceremony's last day, priests would collect the victims' now bloodless arrows and launch them toward the horizon where Orion rose. Watching the shafts arc against the twilight, the crowd would chant until the first drops of rain began to fall, each one believed to carry a fragment of the sacrificed warrior's essence back to Mixcoatl's celestial realm. Today, when modern Mexicans celebrate the arrival of rains by flying colorful kites, they unknowingly echo this ancient dialogue between earth and sky, where suffering once took flight on feathered shafts to bargain for life itself. The warrior's fingers closed around the amulet, its surface still slick with a stranger's blood as it pulsed against his palm like a second heartbeat. This wasn't jewelry, it was stolen vitality, a captured moment of divine energy sealed in gold and jade. When Aztec priests extracted a sacrifice's heart, the organ didn't always meet its end on the altar. For elite warriors, particularly those who had taken captives in battle, the still warm heart could be transformed into a Yolotli Ehuatl heart garment, an amulet believed to transfer the victim's courage directly into its wearer. Spanish accounts describe these grisly talismans being pressed into the hands of fighters before major campaigns. Their surfaces hastily glazed WITH Chinese letter to slow decomposition as they swung from warriors' necks like macabre pendulums. Archaeologists working in the ruins of Tenochtitlan's elite quarters uncovered the physical evidence behind these rituals, not actual hearts but their symbolic counterparts. A noble's tomb excavated near the Templo Mayor contained a jade heart so anatomically precise it bore tiny arteries carved from ruby, its ventricles filled with a darkened resin later identified as human blood mixed WITH Chinese letter. Another discovery revealed a gold heart amulet with a hollow chamber. CT scans showed it once held organic matter, likely a fragment of dried cardiac tissue wrapped in maize husks. These weren't mere representations, they were reliquaries designed to house the essence of what they depicted. The process of creating these amulets was as ritualized as the sacrifices themselves. After extraction, the heart was rinsed in octly fermented megi sap to preserve its spirit before being sliced into sections. The most potent piece, the apex, went to the warrior who captured the victim. The remaining portions were pressed between sheets of gold leaf and sealed with tree resin, sometimes mixed with powdered turquoise to mimic the sacred chalchihuitl energy Aztecs believed flowed through blood and jade alike. Modern spectrographic analysis of these seals reveals traces of Datura, a hallucinogenic plant that may have been used to awaken the amulet's power during ceremonies. What's most startling is how these objects evolved. Early examples from the 14th century show abstract, almost geometric heart shapes, but by Moctezuma's reign, they'd become disturbingly realistic, with some even featuring tiny golden valves that moved when the amulet was tilted, mimicking the pulsing of a living organ. This shift reflects the Aztec belief that as warfare intensified, so too must the connection between killer and killed. A warrior didn't just wear a trophy, he carried a sliver of his victim's tonali, their life force, which was believed to whisper advice during battle. The afterlife of these amulets reveals their true significance. Many were buried with their owners, but not before being ritually killed. Archaeologists have found examples pierced by obsidian blades or cracked open to release their spiritual contents. Some tombs contain amulets stacked like playing cards, suggesting warriors collected multiple hearts over their careers. One exceptional burial held a noble with 7 heart amulets arranged around his skeleton in the shape of Xitlomina, the star constellation that guided fallen warriors to paradise. Perhaps the most poignant discovery came from a mass grave of Spanish conquest-era fighters. Among the skeletons of Aztec warriors, researchers found a single heart amulet clutched in a skeletal hand, its golden surface dented by what appeared to be teeth marks. In the empire's dying days, as foreign steel overwhelmed traditional warfare, some warriors may have bitten their amulets in desperation, trying to consume the last remnants of a vanishing magic. The heart that once promised victory now bore silent witness to defeat, its final resting place a testament to the brutal faith that shaped an empire. The Xochitl pole rose from the heart of Tenochtitlan like a skeletal finger pointing accusingly at the heavens, its surface studded with rows of megi spines sharp enough to pierce bone. This was no mere execution device. It was the centerpiece of a ritual so horrifying even battle-hardened Spanish conquistadors turned away. Captives, often warriors of high rank from rival city-states, were first given pulque laced with potent hallucinogens until their pupils swallowed the whites of their eyes. Then came the climb, forced up the 30-foot pole as drums pounded below, their drugged limbs slipping on the blood of previous victims still coating the wooden shaft. At the top waited no quick death but an excruciating performance. Prisoners were thrown onto the spikes not to impale them, but to hook them, the megi barbs catching under ribs or shoulder blades in a grotesque parody of fishing. Spanish chronicler Andrés de Tapia described how the victims would writhe and spin as their own weight dragged them down the pole. their movements resembling a macabre dance while the crowd below cheered each rotation. The spikes were deliberately spaced to prolong this descent. Forensic analysis of similar poles found in archaeological digs shows precise intervals calculated to maximize suffering without causing immediate fatal wounds. The finale was as calculated as it was cruel. After hours of this slow torture, when the victim reached the base, priests would cut them loose only to immediately throw their bleeding bodies onto a ceremonial bonfire. But even this wasn't the end. Witness accounts describe how some victims, their nervous systems fried by drugs and pain, would stagger back up from the flames like living torches, dancing several more steps before collapsing. The Aztecs called these final spasms Xocotl, meaning fruit in Nahuatl, a chilling metaphor comparing human suffering to ripe harvest falling from the tree. What makes this ritual particularly disturbing is the evidence of careful staging. Excavations near the Templo Mayor have uncovered stone carvings showing poles with strategically placed handholds, suggesting victims were meant to initially cling to life. The narcotics administered weren't random either. Chemical analysis of residue in ritual vessels reveals precise mixtures of Tlaloc, ololiuqui, and morning glory seeds designed to induce both euphoria and paralysis. Victims likely alternated between agony and bliss, their doped brains unable to fully process the horror of their situation. Spanish accounts focused on the spectacle's brutality, but the ceremony's astronomical precision reveals deeper meaning. The Xocotl pole aligned with the rising of the star constellation Tzitzimitl during the festival of Miquelhuatl, when the Aztecs believed the boundary between living and dead grew thin. Each rotation down the pole mirrored the star's celestial movement, while the spikes represented the thorns of the sacred ceiba tree believed to connect earthly and divine realms. In the victim's writhing, priests read omens for the coming year. The more violent the dance, the more prosperous the harvest. Modern archaeology has uncovered an even darker layer. Beneath Xocotl pole sites, researchers found pits filled with strange, fused-together bones. Forensic reconstruction suggests these were victims who survived the initial ordeal, only to be buried alive at the pole's base as permanent spiritual anchors. Some skeletons show signs of deliberate breaking and rearranging, their bones forming literal human foundations for the next year's ceremony. This wasn't just torture, it was architectural, turning suffering into the mortar that held the Aztec cosmos together. Perhaps the most haunting legacy lies in the ritual's unintended afterlife. When Spanish missionaries banned the practice, they unknowingly preserved its essence by replacing the pole with a decorated cross during Christian festivals. To this day, the Danza de los Voladores, where performers spin from tall poles, bears eerie echoes of those ancient sacrifices. The dancers' descents now stripped of blood but still pulsing with the ghostly rhythm of a civilization that believed survival required payment in screams. The banquet hall reeked of copal incense and searing human flesh as noblemen leaned forward in anticipation, their jade lip plugs glinting in the torchlight. Priests distributed steaming portions from clay vessels, not the usual venison or turkey, but the thighs and forearms of a sacrificed warrior, carefully prepared to honor their own fallen ancestors. This wasn't mere survival cannibalism, it was sacred gastronomy where every bite carried the weight of covenant. The Aztecs believed consuming a victim's flesh, especially the protein-rich muscles, allowed their tonally the animating life force concentrated in blood and tissue to merge with the eater's spirit. Spanish friar Bernardino de Sahagun recorded nobles describing the taste as like ripe guava mingled with copper, a metallic tang lingering long after the meal. What set elite cannibalism apart was its ritual precision. Excavations at Texcoco's royal palace revealed special kitchens with distinct cookware, obsidian-bladed knives reserved for butchering human remains, and Xoctli pots with interior ridges to skim sacred fats during boiling. Forensic analysis shows meat was always parboiled first, not just for tenderness, but to remove identifying features like fingerprints or tattoos, easing psychological barriers. Nobles received specific body parts based on rank. Warriors ate hearts to absorb courage, priests consumed hands to gain dexterity for bloodletting rites, while the emperor dined on slivers of liver believed to house a person's wisdom. The Florentine Codex depicts these feasts with unsettling etiquette diners using golden skewers to avoid touching the flesh directly, as if handling relics rather than food. Commoners participated differently. During public festivals like Tlaloc Xipe Totec, stews made from sacrifice victims' less desirable remains, intestines, feet, and organs, were distributed in the plaza. Archaeological digs at market sites uncovered mass-produced cazuelas with traces of human myoglobin alongside maize and chilies, suggesting a pragmatic, almost industrial approach. Unlike the noble ceremonial consumption, these distributions were swift and functional, more akin to communion wafers than feasting. Spanish accounts mention some peasants hiding portions to bury in their fields, treating the flesh as fertilizer rather than food. The psychological dimension reveals even deeper layers. Victims selected for these rituals were often adopted by their consumers months before death, living as honored guests in their future eater's household. A noble might host his destined sacrifice at banquets, forging bonds before that same man's heart later graced his plate. Murals at Calixtlahuaca show this eerie intimacy, a lord hand feeding a captive while priests paint his body for slaughter in the background. Modern psychologists suggest this practice created a form of cognitive dissonance, allowing perpetrators to revere those they'd later consume by framing it as transformation rather than murder. Perhaps most telling are the leftovers. Excavations of midden piles near temples uncovered human bones cracked open for marrow, but arranged in neat stacks rather than scattered. These weren't discarded scraps, but ritually depleted vessels, the inedible remnants of spiritual transactions. Some skulls showed chew marks around the eye sockets, suggesting final nibbles of tender facial muscles as a parting gesture. The Aztecs took their covenant seriously. To waste a sacrifice would insult the gods, so every sinew had purpose. Even the bones found secondary use, ground into powder for ceramic glazes or carved into flute mouthpieces, ensuring the dead continued to speak. This wasn't mindless brutality, but a brutal kind of arithmetic. In a world where energy couldn't be created or destroyed, only transferred, the cannibal feasts were the ultimate recycling program. A warrior's strength didn't vanish when his heart was lifted to the sun. It flowed into those who consumed him, a grotesque but logical economy of vitality. When modern nutritionists analyze the Aztec diet, they note its remarkable protein efficiency, maize complemented by just enough human flesh to prevent deficiency in a civilization with few domesticated animals. The banquets fed both bodies and beliefs, turning the act of eating into the ultimate act of faith. The flesh wasn't just meat, it was living sacrament, each strip of muscle a sacrament tied to the myth of Xipe, the maize god whose shattered body birthed the first crops. When Aztec priests butchered sacrificial victims, they weren't merely dividing a corpse, they were reenacting the primordial moment when the gods tore Xipe apart, his fingers becoming sweet potatoes, his nails sprouting chili plants, and his blood bubbling up as the first chocolate. Spanish chroniclers recorded priests chanting over dismembered limbs, "Be as the God who feeds us," draping intestinal coils around corn stalks like gruesome fertilizer. Excavations at El Tepozteco revealed terraced fields where human rib cages were planted upright between maize rows, their hollow cavities packed with sprouting seeds, a literal fusion of flesh and agriculture. The parallels between victim and vegetation were meticulously staged. Victims chosen for these rites were often painted yellow like ripe corn, their hair braided with husks. Before execution, they'd be fed a diet of amaranth and chia to plump their muscles, mimicking the fat kernels of healthy maize. Forensic analysis of bones from these sacrifices shows strikingly high levels of nitrogen and phosphorus nutrients that, when returned to the soil through decomposition, actually boosted crop yields. The Aztecs may not have understood biochemistry, but their rituals accidentally perfected the science of nutrient cycling. Certain body parts held specific agricultural symbolism. Thigh meat was buried at field boundaries to strengthen the land's bones, while the liver believed to harbor a person's vitality was pureed into a paste and smeared on planting sticks. The most chilling practice involved the victim's skin. After flaying, priests would stretch the epidermis over wooden frames and hurl it into fields during rain dances, where the rehydrated flesh was thought to attract storms like morbid lightning rods. Murals at Teotihuacan depict this vividly, human skins billowing like sails over cornfields, their empty eye sockets weeping ritual blood that trickles into irrigation channels. The maize-god connection extended beyond mere metaphor. During the festival of Xipe Totec, children selected for sacrifice were dressed as miniature Sintiotls, their thumbs bound together to resemble corn cobs. After their hearts were extracted, the bodies were carefully disarticulated at the joints, not hacked apart, but separated cleanly like ears of corn from a stalk. Spanish friar Diego Duran witnessed priests arranging these pieces in basket-lined pits, alternating layers of child flesh with maize seeds. When sprouting occurred days later, it was hailed as the god's rebirth, the victim's last screams still echoing in the stalks when wind rustled through the fields. Modern archaeology confirms the eerie effectiveness of these rituals. Soil samples from sacrifice-laden fields show elevated levels of zinc and iron micronutrients critical for plant health that would have leached from decomposing bodies. The same pits where victims were buried now produce corn with unusually high kernel counts, their roots still tangled with fragments of bone and turquoise beads left as offerings. Science now understands what the Aztecs intuited: death feeds life in an unbroken chain. When contemporary farmers in Oaxaca whisper prayers to the soil before planting, they unknowingly echo a truth their ancestors enacted in blood and bone: that every harvest is a resurrection paid for in advance. The steam clung thick as smoke as the victims were led into the dim, dome-shaped chamber, their bare feet slipping on sweat-slicked stones. This was no ordinary bath. The Aztec temazcal was a womb of purification, where the boundary between cleansing and torture blurred into something almost holy. Before meeting the obsidian blade, these chosen ones would spend hours steeped in scalding vapor infused with Yortli herbs and crushed chilies, their lungs burning with each stifled breath. Archaeologists excavating these surviving sweat lodges near Tlaloc found walls stained black with generations of soot and resin, not from fire alone, but from the noxious clouds of Chilmali smoke priests pumped inside to open the soul's pathways. The process was as methodical as it was merciless. Attendants first scrubbed the victim's skin with abrasive magi fibers, removing not just dirt but symbolic impurities. Then came the steam, poured over volcanic rocks heated in an adjacent fire pit, the water laced with hallucinogenic mushrooms and the powdered bones of previous sacrifices. Spanish chronicler Bernardino de Sahagun described the eerie sight of victims emerging mid-ritual, their bodies flushed crimson, their eyes rolling back as the chili-laced air triggered reflexive screams. These weren't cries of pain but sacred utterances. The steam was thought to carry their unfiltered pleas directly to the gods. Some never left the temazcal alive. In the ritual's most extreme form, priests would seal the door and heap fresh chilies onto the coals, creating a suffocating miasma that overwhelmed the nervous system. Excavations at Teotihuacan revealed skeletons curled in fetal positions near sweat lodge drains, their bones showing no signs of violence except contracted rib cages, silent witnesses to death by asphyxiation. The Aztecs called this nextlahueltin, the stripping away, believing the chili smoke scoured the victim's spirit clean before it embarked on its cosmic journey. What seems like pointless cruelty served a profound symbolic purpose. The Temazcal mirrored the mythical cave of Chicomostoc, where the Aztecs believed humanity emerged through 7 chambers of increasing heat. By subjecting sacrifices to similar trials, they recreated this primordial birth in reverse, the steam dissolving mortal ties as the chilly smoke propelled the soul toward divinity. Modern reconstructions show these structures were acoustically perfect. A whisper at the entrance could be heard clearly in the rear, allowing priests to guide victims through chanted instructions even as consciousness faded. The surviving temazcales scattered across Mexico still bear haunting traces of these rituals. At Melanalco, one lodge's ceiling shows faint handprints in hematite pigment, likely from victims bracing against the stones as the heat peaked. Another in Tepoztlan has ventilation shafts positioned to align with Venus on the winter solstice, proving these were as much astronomical instruments as purification chambers. When modern spa-goers today relax in replica sweat lodges, they're unwittingly stepping into spaces where agony and transcendence once danced on the same scalding breath. The women stood motionless in the temple courtyard, their bodies painted the deep blue of twilight, feathered wings strapped to their arms shimmering like fractured obsidian. These weren't mere impersonators of Itzpapalotl, the fearsome, obsidian butterfly goddess. They were living vessels of her wrath, chosen for their ability to withstand the ritual's brutal poetry. When the moon's shadow began creeping across the sun, signaling the start of a solar eclipse, the priests would guide these women to stone slabs carved with intricate wing patterns. The slabs weren't flat like ordinary altars, but concave, designed to cradle the body in a posture mimicking a butterfly mid-metamorphosis. As the eclipse reached totality, plunging the world into eerie half-light, the ceremony reached its crescendo. Using blades forged from volcanic glass mined during lunar eclipses, priests made a single incision along the sternum, not the typical heart extraction cut, but a precise T-shaped opening meant to resemble the chrysalis of an emerging butterfly. Spanish chronicler Hernando Alvarado Tezazomoc described the blood as black as the vanished sun, pooling in the altar's grooves to form shimmering patterns that mirrored the goddess's celestial wings. Forensic analysis of these altars reveals microscopic layers of iron and oxidized copper, suggesting the blood was mixed with sacred minerals to create a permanent chromatic tribute to the eclipse. What followed was even more extraordinary. Unlike typical sacrifices where the heart was immediately offered to the gods, these rituals involved a prolonged, almost surgical process. The priests would carefully separate the ribs without severing them entirely, folding back the skin and muscle to create a grotesque semblance of butterfly wings. Murals at Templo Mayor depict this moment with unsettling accuracy. The victim's torso transformed into a living representation of Itzpapalotl's mythic form, her skeletal wings glistening in the unnatural darkness. Some accounts suggest the women were given potent doses of ololiuqui beforehand. Their drug-induced euphoria allowing them to remain conscious during this horrific metamorphosis. The timing of these sacrifices reveals their astronomical precision. Solar eclipses were seen as moments when Itzpapalotl, normally a protective warrior goddess, transformed into her most destructive aspect, the devourer of light. By opening these human cocoons during the eclipse's peak, the Aztecs believed they were helping rebirth the sun, the victim's screams serving as a spiritual catalyst to drive the moon's shadow away. Modern excavations near the Templo Mayor uncovered a cache of ceremonial blades still stained with eclipse blood. A term used by researchers after spectral analysis revealed traces of solar observatory soot mixed with the hemoglobin, suggesting the weapons were purified in temple fires burning during previous celestial events. The aftermath of these rituals held its own eerie symbolism. After the eclipse passed, the bodies weren't discarded but carefully preserved. Their flayed torsos were stuffed with aromatic herbs and suspended from wooden frames in temple courtyards, where the drying flesh would twist and contract in the wind, a macabre dance mimicking the obsidian butterfly's flight. Spanish accounts describe these shrines buzzing with actual butterflies drawn to the decomposing remains, an unintended yet poetic reinforcement of the ritual's core metaphor. Archaeologists have even found ceramic incense burners shaped like Itzpapalotl, designed to be placed beneath the dangling corpses so their rising smoke would carry the victim's spirit skyward. Perhaps most haunting is the legacy of these sacrifices in modern Mexican folklore. In some indigenous communities, solar eclipses are still referred to as Itzpapalotl's wings passing over the sun, and butterflies that land on people during these events are considered omens. The same hands that once performed these brutal rites also painted stunning frescoes of the goddess's celestial beauty, revealing the Aztec capacity to hold horror and reverence in the same breath. When scientists today calculate ancient eclipse paths with digital precision, their maps sometimes overlap exactly with temple sites where these sacrifices occurred, proof that beneath the ritual's brutality lay an understanding of cosmic rhythms we've only recently begun to match. The noble's skin gleamed with sweat as jeweled fingers pressed the sharpened jade point against a raised patch of thigh, the muscle tensing in anticipation. This wasn't adornment, it was divine interface, a physical port where mortal flesh met sacred stone. The Aztec elite didn't merely wear jade, they implanted it, driving polished plugs through self-made incisions in rituals that transformed their bodies into living temples. At Tlaloco's burial sites, archaeologists uncovered nobles with dozens of these plugs still embedded in their pelvic bones, jawlines, and even eyelids, each insertion point calculated to mirror the wounds inflicted on their gods during creation myths. The plugs themselves were miniature masterpieces, carved from imperial jade so pure it emitted a watery glow under torchlight. Many were shaped like serpent fangs or teardrops to symbolize the divine suffering they commemorated. Recent CT scans of excavated specimens reveal microscopic channels drilled through their cores, deliberate passageways allowing blood to flow continuously rather than clotting around the jewel. Some even contained hollow chambers packed with mixtures of hallucinogenic mushrooms and crushed cochineal insects, creating slow-release spiritual cocktails that seeped into the bloodstream as the wearer moved. The insertion ceremony was a spectacle of controlled agony. After days of fasting and pulque-induced trances, the noble would recline on a mat woven from megi fibers, the same plant that provided the bone needles used to pierce their flesh. A priest would heat the jade point in copal smoke before driving it home with a mallet made from a sacrificial victim's femur. Spanish chronicles describe how the subjects rarely screamed, their teeth gritted around leather straps as attendants caught the first spurts of blood in ceremonial bowls shaped like open flowers. What elevates this practice beyond mere masochism is its anatomical precision. Excavated remains show the plugs were strategically placed to avoid major arteries while maximizing visibility. The inner forearm for merchants to display during trade negotiations, the calves for warriors to flash while running into battle. Some nobles developed intricate signaling systems, rotating certain plugs to convey messages in court without speaking. A jade stud twisted clockwise at the collarbone might indicate alliance, while one removed entirely could signal impending betrayal. The most shocking discovery came from biochemical analysis of the plugs. Many tested positive for traces of human blood, not just from their wearers but from multiple individuals. This suggests the jewels were periodically fed with sacrificial blood during renewal ceremonies, turning each noble into a walking reliquary. Murals at Teotihuacan depict this vividly. Rulers kneeling as priests anoint their embedded jades with fresh heart blood, the dark liquid seeping into the stone's pores like rainwater into thirsty earth. Modern gemologists have discovered why jade was so crucial to these rites. Under microscopic examination, high-grade jade exhibits a unique fibrous structure that causes it to resonate at frequencies matching human vocal ranges. When worn during chants, the plugs would subtly vibrate, creating a physical feedback loop that convinced the nobles they were literally humming with divine energy. The same stones that adorned their flesh also adorned the god statues, bridges between earthly and celestial realms, pulsing with the same lifeblood. For the Aztec elite, these weren't decorations but dials on the cosmic radio, their bodies tuned to frequencies only the gods could broadcast. When Spanish conquistadors later tore the plugs from living nobles as trophies, they missed the point entirely. The real treasure wasn't the jewel, but the sacred wound left behind, a silent mouth still whispering prayers to forgotten deities. The pulque flowed thick and milky, poured from golden goblets into the mouths of bound captives until their eyelids fluttered with forced euphoria. This wasn't mercy, it was alchemy. The Aztecs believed the fermented agave drink, pulque, carried octli, the divine essence of Mayahul, the goddess whose 400 breasts fed the earth with intoxicating nourishment. Victims selected for these ceremonies weren't merely drugged into submission. They were ritually transformed, their ordinary consciousness dissolved to make them vessels for the gods' voices. Spanish friars documented prisoners giggling as priests painted their bodies with hallucinogenic ointments, their pupils blown wide as they stumbled toward the obsidian blade with unsettling glee. What sets these sacrifices apart is the meticulous staging of intoxication. Unlike haphazard drowning in alcohol, the pulque was administered in precise increments over days, starting with light doses to open the soul's pathways, then escalating to near-lethal quantities by the ritual's climax. Archaeologists analyzing ceramic vessels from these ceremonies found residue layers confirming this graduated approach. Early cups contained pulque mixed with mild stimulants like guayusa leaf, while final drafts were spiked with datura and morning glory seeds, concoctions potent enough to induce out-of-body experiences. The goal wasn't numbness but hyper-awareness, a state where the victim's dying screams were thought to carry divine messages. The spiritual logic was chillingly coherent. Pulque's frothy texture mirrored the foam of creation myths when the gods sacrificed themselves to set the cosmos in motion. By intoxicating victims, priests recreated that primordial intoxication, blurring the line between killer and killed. Murals at Collioure depict this symbiosis, captives and executioners sharing the same drink from twin-spouted vessels, their faces merging into a single visage as the hallucinogens took hold. Modern chemists testing residue from these vessels identified traces of human blood mixed with the pulque, likely from ritual bloodletting beforehand, turning the brew into a gruesome communion wine. Some rites took the symbolism further. At the festival of Izcalli, children destined for sacrifice were given pulque through hollow reeds while submerged in ceremonial pools, their drunken bubbles rising as they communed with the water spirits. Excavations at these sites reveal skeletons with jawbones stained blue from prolonged contact with the fermented liquid, their teeth worn down from chewing agave fibers during the ritual. The most disturbing finds are the small, pulque-soaked clay dolls clutched in their hands, figurines that, when analyzed, contained traces of tears, likely from parents forced to witness the ceremonies. The aftermath of these intoxicated sacrifices held its own macabre poetry. Unlike standard rituals where blood was immediately offered to idols, the pulque-laced blood from these victims was fermented for 40 days in sealed jars. The resulting viscous liquid, called Tlaloc or heart drink, was used to anoint newborns and warriors, believed to transfer the victim's courage and the god's favor. Spanish accounts describe nobles sipping drops of this substance before battle, their subsequent frenzy making them nearly impervious to pain. Forensic analysis of drinking cups from elite burials confirms the practice. Some still held residues of human hemoglobin cross-contaminated with pulque enzymes. Perhaps the ritual's most haunting legacy lies in its accidental pharmacology. Modern research shows pulque contains vitamin B12 and probiotics, nutrients the Aztecs could have consumed safely through normal drinking. By reserving it for sacrificial rites, they elevated intoxication from mere physiology to sacred theater, where altered states weren't escapism but bridges to the divine. When contemporary Mexican festivals feature pulque drinking contests, few realize they echo ceremonies where every sip was a countdown to extinction, and every slurred word a prayer written in vanishing ink. The priest's fingers traced the hollow eye sockets of the skull mask before lifting it to his face, the bone still warm from the sacred brazier's heat. This was no ordinary disguise, it was a sacred merging where the living breathed life back into the dead for one final communion. The Aztecs didn't just memorialize their sacrifices, they wore them, transforming priests into chimeric beings that straddled the boundary between this world and the next. The most revered of these masks, like the infamous Tezcatlipoca skull in the British Museum, weren't mere replicas. They were actual cranial bones, meticulously cleaned and painted with swirling obsidian patterns, the nasal cavity lined with gold to mimic divine breath. Wearing these masks wasn't merely ceremonial, it was possession. Spanish chroniclers described priests convulsing as they donned the skulls, their voices dropping to guttural whispers as they channeled the deceased spirit. The Florentine Codex recounts how some masks were fed during rituals, with attendants dripping pulque or blood through the suture lines onto the priest's tongue below. Modern CT scans of surviving masks reveal microscopic channels drilled into the palate, suggesting a gruesome form of ventriloquism. The priest's words filtered through the bone, emerging distorted as if spoken from beyond the grave. The Tezcatlipoca mask stands apart for its horrifying intimacy. Carved from a single human cranium, its interior still bears tooth marks along the cheekbones, likely from the original owner clenching their jaw during sacrifice. The exterior shimmers with turquoise mosaic but tilted just so, and the light reveals another layer, intricate carvings of stars and sacrificial knives hidden beneath the gemstones, visible only when the mask catches firelight at specific angles. This wasn't just artistry, it was sacred engineering. The Aztecs believed the mask's true power activated at certain celestial alignments, its eye sockets casting shadows that pointed to sacrificial stones during equinoxes. Archaeologists have uncovered workshops where these masks were broken in. Priests would sleep with them for weeks, allowing the bone to absorb their breath and sweat, creating a biological bond. Residue tests show some were smoked over copal fires until the marrow cavities filled with resin, turning each into a primitive recording device. The heat-activated scent releasing the victim's voice during rituals. Other masks were fitted with movable jaws operated by hidden strings, allowing the wearer to make the skull speak while maintaining the illusion of supernatural control. The mask's afterlife reveals their enduring power. Many were buried with their priestly wearers, but not before being ritually killed, a single spike driven through the left orbit to release the trapped spirit. Modern conservators working on the Tezcatlipoca mask discovered something unsettling, tiny plant fibers deep in the nasal cavity. DNA analysis identified them as morning glory vines, likely inserted to induce hallucinations in the wearer. Even now, 5 centuries removed from its last ritual, the mask retains traces of scopolamine, a potent tropane alkaloid that could make a priest genuinely believe the bone was whispering to him. These ceremonies forced an uncomfortable truth. For the Aztecs, death wasn't an end, but a transfer of energy. When a priest danced in a victim's skull, he wasn't just honoring the dead, he was harvesting their lingering tonally, the life force clinging to the bone. The same hands that flayed flesh from craniums also polished the interiors smooth as eggshells, a grotesque tenderness underscoring their belief that every scream, every drop of blood, every final breath could be preserved and reused. The masks weren't relics, they were batteries charged with agony and waiting to be plugged into the living. The drums fell silent as the sky darkened at midday, not with clouds but with the moon's slow devouring of the sun. In the sudden twilight, priests scrambled up the Templo Mayor's steps, their voices raw with warnings that this was no ordinary eclipse. The Aztecs called it Tenatia Qualo, the sun being eaten, and their response was a frenzy of sacrifice unmatched by any other event. Unlike rituals tied to seasonal cycles, eclipses struck without warning, triggering visceral terror that the cosmic balance had snapped. Spanish chronicler Bernardino de Sahagún described panicked crowds slashing their own ears to spill blood toward the vanishing sun, while priests dragged forward Chinese letter captives by the dozen, their obsidian blades flashing in the unnatural half-light. What made these sacrifices unique was their astronomical precision. Without telescopes or written records, Aztec skywatchers could predict eclipses within hours using the Tonalpohualli, a 260-day sacred calendar interlocked with the solar year like gears in a celestial machine. Excavations at the Templo Mayor uncovered a chamber filled with carved date markers corresponding to historic eclipses, proving their forecasts weren't guesswork but calculated science. The most chilling discovery, a black stone altar angled to cast a dagger-shaped shadow during totality, a visual countdown showing priests exactly when to strike. The victims chosen for these rites weren't random. Warriors captured during flowery wars were reserved specifically for eclipse emergencies, their vitality seen as solar fuel. Spanish accounts describe how these men were painted head to toe in yellow ochre and crowned with feathered sun discs, then positioned on platforms so their falling bodies would push the moon's shadow away. Forensic archaeologists found clusters of skeletons near observatory sites with identical fracture patterns, ribs shattered from high falls, suggesting some were thrown from pyramids mid-eclipse to amplify their sacrificial power. Modern astronomers have verified the Aztecs' eerie accuracy. By cross-referencing their eclipse markers with NASA retroactive sky maps, researchers found their predictions aligned within a 3-hour window, a margin narrow enough to mobilize entire cities for ritual panic. The same priests who trembled before the darkened sun could also chart its return with cold precision, blending terror and trigonometry in ways that still defy easy categorization. Perhaps the most haunting evidence lies in the artistic record. A recently deciphered codex depicts an eclipse ritual where priests arranged victims in a spiral pattern, their blood channels forming a liquid replica of the sun's corona. Spectral analysis of temple murals revealed traces of iron and mercury in the paint, materials chosen because they gleam brightest in low light, ensuring the gods could see the offerings even during totality. This wasn't just desperation, it was a carefully staged performance of terror and control, where human lives became brushstrokes in a cosmological plea. The rituals didn't end when sunlight returned. For days afterward, the Aztecs would test the rejuvenated sun by holding mirrors to captives' faces. If the reflection appeared dim, more sacrifices were required. Excavated mass graves from post-eclipse periods contain victims of all ages and statuses, suggesting no one was exempt when the cosmic ledger demanded payment. In their frantic calculus, every scream was an interest payment on the universe's survival, every drop of blood a down payment on tomorrow's dawn. The torchlight flickered against the damp cave walls as the priests descended deeper into Sincalco. Not just a cavern, but a living throat of the earth, where the boundary between the living world and Mictlan, the Aztec underworld, grew treacherously thin. This wasn't mere spelunking, it was a perilous negotiation with the dead. The air thickened with the scent of burning copal and something darker, the musk of decay from bundles of human bones arranged in concentric circles along the passage. Each skull faced inward, their hollow sockets watching as priests prepared for the most dangerous ritual of all, a face-to-face audience with Mictlantecutli, the skeletal god who ruled the land of eternal silence. To reach the underworld, the priests first had to mimic its conditions. Spanish chronicler Diego de Ron recorded their descent, barefoot, stripped of all ornaments, their bodies rubbed with ash to blend with the shadows. The caves weren't chosen at random, their twisting passages mirrored the 9 layers of Mictlan, with specific chambers designated for each stage of the soul's journey. Archaeologists mapping Sincalco found eerie confirmation of this belief. Natural limestone formations resembling crouching figures, their outlines accentuated with carved bone fragments and patches of cinnabar paint that still glowed rust red after centuries. The deepest chamber, called the listening place, held the ritual's crux, a sunken pool filled not with water, but with a viscous brew of pulque, powdered obsidian, and the dissolved remains of sacrificial victims. The priest's preparation was a cocktail of pharmacology and piety. For days beforehand, they ingested ointments made from the venom of Montezuma's leopard frog, mixed with morning glory seeds, a psychedelic paste that induced visions of the underworld's labyrinth. But the true key to crossing over lay in the Tlaloc, the god's food, a revolting paste of soot, crushed emerald, and the powdered femurs of past sacrifices. Spread on the tongue, it allegedly turned the voice into an echo of the dead, allowing communication with Mictlantecutli himself. Modern chemists analyzing residue in ceremonial bowls from these caves identified scopolamine and atropine, compounds that induced terrifying hallucinations of skeletal figures and a sensation of being buried alive. Once in the trance state, the ritual reached its crescendo. Priests would lie in the bone-lined pools, their submerged ears plugged with wax to hear only the voices below, while attendants above drummed on hollow logs tuned to mimic a heartbeat slowing to stillness. The Florentine Codex describes how participants often clawed at their own faces in this phase, mistaking their living flesh for rotting skin in the underworld's grip. Those who returned not all brought back prophecies written in a code only the emperor could decipher, their arms often bearing self-inflicted wounds that formed sacred patterns, spirals for rebirth, zigzags for the treacherous underworld rivers. The caves themselves became repositories of these visions. Recent lidar scans revealed hidden niches filled with ceramic vessels shaped like gaping mouths, each containing a human tooth, a jade bead, and a single drop of mercury representing the mutable nature of truth. Some alcoves held bundles of amate paper stained with blood, their folded layers preserving the whispered words of the dead. The most chilling discovery was a cluster of child-sized handprints pressed into the clay near the final chamber, their fingers elongated unnaturally, likely from being held in place until the mud dried as part of a ritual anchoring of spirits. What makes these ceremonies so unsettling is their lingering physicality. Unlike temple sacrifices where bodies were burned or buried, the cave rituals left traces that feel unnervingly present. Visitors today report a persistent scent of mushrooms and wet limestone. Though no fungi grow there naturally, audio recordings often capture faint drumbeats in frequencies below human hearing, matching the descriptions of the Tlapanhahuatl, the drum that plays itself to guide lost souls. The Aztecs believed these caves weren't just passages to the underworld, they were its waiting room, a place where the dead lingered until their names were spoken aloud in ceremony. Even now, 5 centuries later, the weight of those unanswered whispers still presses against the damp stone walls. The pregnant woman knelt on the mat, her swollen belly painted with intricate swirls of blue and green colors of the earth goddess Tlaloc, whose skirt of serpents birthed both stars and sorrow. This was no ordinary sacrifice, but a sacred unbinding, where life still coiled in the womb would be offered before drawing its first breath. The obsidian knife used for this ritual wasn't the standard heart extraction blade, but a curved tool called a miquistli, its edge honed to mirror the crescent moon's embrace. Spanish chronicler Hernando Alvarado Tezazomoc described the procedure with horrified fascination. Priests would chant invocations to Tlaloc while gently palpating the woman's abdomen, mapping the unborn child's position before making a single vertical incision not to kill, but to harvest, their hands moving with the precision of midwives attending a cosmic delivery. The theological underpinnings of this ritual reveal its brutal logic. The Aztecs believed the earth itself was a pregnant body, its mountains her swollen breasts, its rivers her nourishing milk. By offering life at its most potent, literally on the threshold of existence, they sought to repay the debt of fertility. Murals at Teotihuacan depict this exchange in visceral detail. Women with split torsos releasing infant-shaped maize stalks, their blood transforming into vines that curl around the goddess's stone skirts. Archaeologists excavating a shrine near Tlaloc uncovered tiny skeletons wrapped in miniature sorope blankets, their delicate bones arranged in fetal positions inside ceramic jars shaped like uteri. Forensic analysis showed these were full-term infants, their skulls bearing the telltale marks of ritual trepanation holes drilled not post-mortem, but during the extraction process, suggesting their last moments were spent as living conduits between worlds. The selection process for these sacrifices was as methodical as it was merciless. Women weren't chosen randomly, but for specific astrological alignments. Their pregnancies had to coincide with the appearance of Xitlapol, the Aztec name for Venus when it shone as the morning star. Recent studies of recovered sacrificial registers reveal even more precise criteria. Preferred candidates showed a hereditary trait of heterochromia, one blue eye, one brown, believed to mark them as direct descendants of the goddess herself. Some were royal concubines, their bodies prepared for this purpose since adolescence through diets rich in amaranth and chia to ensure robust fertility. Their final days were spent in a twilight state of reverence and dread, bathed in rosewater, fed honeyed tortillas, but also subjected to nightly smoke ceremonies where copal and ground jade were blown into their cervixes to purify the unborn. What happened after the ritual was equally significant. The mother's body wasn't discarded but carefully butchered, her liver considered especially potent. Priests would dry the organ into thin sheets, then burn them in fields as seed paper, believing the smoke carried her life force directly into the soil. The Micwistly knife used in the procedure required its own ceremony after each use. It was plunged into a vat of fermented agave sap to cool its spiritual heat, then wrapped in the umbilical cords of previous sacrifices. Excavations at the Templo Mayor uncovered one such knife still encased in a hardened cocoon of these cords, the obsidian blade gleaming beneath layers of keratinized tissue when researchers carefully dissected the bundle. The children's remains received even more elaborate treatment. Their hearts, no larger than thumbnails, were placed in gold reliquaries shaped like corn husks and hung around the necks of farming officials during planting season. Spanish accounts describe terraced hillsides where these officials would walk backwards, dragging the reliquaries through freshly turned earth to plant the infant's energy. Modern soil analysis in these areas shows elevated levels of phosphorus and nitrogen, unintentional proof that the ritual worked, though not in the way the Aztecs intended. The bones were ground into powder and mixed with clay to form tiny effigies of Xochiquetzal, the flower goddess, which were then buried at the four corners of cornfields. Some of these figurines still survive, their surfaces bearing tiny fingerprints where priests pressed the damp clay into shape. Perhaps the most haunting aspect is how these practices echo in contemporary traditions. In some rural Mexican communities, midwives still bury placentas near young crops, a sanitized remnant of that ancient belief in reciprocity between birth and harvest. The same hands that once wielded the Micwistly also painted breathtaking murals celebrating fertility, their art oscillating between reverence and terror. When archaeologists recently discovered a mass grave of perinatal remains near Mexico City's metro construction site, they noted something unexpected. The bones were arranged in spiral patterns mirroring the galaxy's shape, each tiny skeleton a star in Tlalocu's celestial womb. This wasn't senseless violence, it was a desperate, distorted love letter to a universe that gives only when fed, where the line between creation and destruction blurs like blood in water. The marketplace chatter stilled as the procession passed not priests or warriors, but dozens of yellow-coated dogs, their fur dyed vibrant ochre with sacred Xochipalli flowers. These weren't mere strays, they were psychopomps in canine form, living compasses calibrated to navigate the 9 treacherous layers of Mictlan, the Aztec underworld. Spanish chronicler Bernardino de Sahagún recorded the eerie calm of these doomed guides as priests led them to the temple steps, noting how they rarely resisted, as if sensing their cosmic purpose. Modern excavations near the Templo Mayor uncovered mass graves confirming these accounts, hundreds of canine skeletons arranged in perfect spirals, their skulls all pointing west toward the setting sun, the symbolic gateway to the afterlife. What makes these sacrifices unique is their paradoxical tenderness. The dogs weren't simply slaughtered, they were ceremonially married to the deceased, bound together by cords dipped in liquefied amber. Forensic analysis of these burial sites reveals many dogs were elderly or infirm, suggesting the Aztecs selected pets who'd already demonstrated loyalty in life to perform this final service. Some skeletons still wore woven cotton collars with tiny copper bells, their careful placement proving this was no hasty disposal of remains. The most poignant discovery came from a noble's tomb at Tlaloc. A small yellow dog curled around its master's feet, its jaws gently clasping the man's big toe in an ancient Mesoamerican gesture symbolizing guidance. The ritual itself was steeped in underworld symbolism. Priests would paint blue stripes on the dog's muzzles to mirror the rivers of Mictlan, then feed them a last meal of amaranth cakes shaped like bones, food for the journey ahead. Unlike most sacrifices involving swift heart extraction, these ceremonies often employed strangulation with Magi fiber ropes, a method believed to preserve the soul's integrity for its navigational task. Archaeologists found many dog skeletons with hyoid bones fractured in this distinctive pattern, confirming the historical accounts. Some graves even contained miniature clay boats placed between the dog's paws, representing the vessels that would ferry souls across the underground rivers. The choice of yellow dogs wasn't arbitrary. Aztec cosmology associated this coloration with Xolotl, the twin-faced god of twilight who could traverse between worlds. Murals at Teotihuacan depict these golden guides with human hands emerging from their mouths, symbolizing their role as speakers who could negotiate with Mictlantecutli, the skeletal lord of death. Recent isotope analysis of the buried dog's teeth suggests many were raised on special diets including human breast milk, possibly to strengthen their connection to mankind before the ultimate voyage. Perhaps the most startling insight comes from the dog's afterlife in Aztec belief. Unlike humans whose souls underwent a 4-year journey through Mictlan, these canine companions were thought to dissolve into the underworld's fabric itself, becoming living landmarks in the eternal darkness. Spanish accounts mention families keeping tufts of their sacrificed dog's fur as talismans, believing the fibers would twitch when the dead relative reached each successive layer. Today, when Mexican folklore speaks of stray yellow dogs lingering near cemeteries, they're unknowingly echoing a tradition where love and duty transcended even the boundaries of death, where the ultimate loyalty meant plunging into darkness so your human wouldn't walk alone. The paper crackled like dry skin as the priest peeled back another sheet of amate, its fibrous surface drinking up the blood pooled in the ceremonial bowl. This wasn't ordinary paper, it was flesh of the gods, crafted from the inner bark of wild fig trees whose sinewy veins mirrored the very arteries the Aztecs believed connected earth to heaven. Each sheet was a blank slate for divine negotiation, a fragile yet potent medium that transformed human suffering into celestial currency. The Florentine Codex shows these rituals in eerie detail. Priests dipping brushes made from human hair into still steaming sacrificial blood, painting intricate effigies of deities whose hollow eyes seemed to blink when the torchlight hit the damp fibers just right. What made these paper gods so unsettling was their impermanence. Unlike stone idols that endured for generations, these effigies were designed to burn, their destruction the entire point. Spanish chronicler Diego Durán described the process with horrified fascination. After drying in the sun, the blood-soaked figures were folded into origami-like shapes representing specific gods: Huitzilopochtli as a warbird, Tlaloc with his serpentine goggles, Xipe Totec's flayed skin rendered in delicate pleats. Then came the moment of transformation. Tossed into ceramic braziers lined with copal resin, the effigies didn't just smolder. They danced, the blood acting as a grisly accelerant that made the flames leap blue-green while releasing a scent compared by the Aztecs to the god's own breath. Archaeologists have found remnants of these ceremonies in the most unexpected places. Beneath the floorboards of a priest's residence near Texcoco, excavators uncovered a stash of half-burnt amate fragments, their edges charred but the central design still visible under infrared light. One depicted a hybrid creature, part jaguar, part hummingbird, with glyphs identifying it as a messenger to the sun god. Chemical analysis revealed something even more revealing. The paint wasn't just blood, but a precise mixture of hemoglobin, ground jade, and Yortley flowers, creating a combustible cocktail that burned at precisely the temperature Aztec astronomers associated with celestial pathways. The timing of these rituals reveals their strategic brilliance. Blood paper effigies were often burned during planetary alignments, particularly when Venus appeared as the morning star. The Aztecs believed the smoke carried their petitions along star roads, invisible threads connecting earthly fires to divine realms. Modern atmospheric scientists confirm there was strange logic behind this. Smoke particles rising at dawn during certain seasons could indeed catch high-altitude winds that carried them astonishing distances. One mural at Melanalco even shows priests releasing paper effigies like kites, their strings attached to burning fuses, creating airborne pleas that vanished into the clouds. But the most haunting evidence comes from the effigies themselves. The Dresden Codex contains a folio showing a priest holding a paper figure whose outline exactly matches a silhouette found in the volcanic ash layers of Popocatépetl from 1446, proof that someone had been tracking these rituals' celestial impact. Another discovery in a sealed cave near Chile yielded a pottery shard with handprints in blood-soaked paper residue. The fingerprints so perfectly preserved we can still see where the priest's thumb smudged Tlaloc's mouth, as if silencing the rain god until the proper offering was made. In the end, these weren't just symbols or sacrifices, they were the Aztec equivalent of cosmic text messages, written in a language of hemoglobin and ash. When the flames consumed them, the priests didn't mourn. They watched the rising smoke with the intensity of astronomers tracking comets. Each curling wisp was a syllable in an ongoing dialogue with forces beyond human understanding, a conversation where every reply came as rain, as war, as the terrible gift of another sunrise bought with ink that had once pulsed through living veins. The earth trembled beneath their feet as the procession climbed Popocatépettl's ashen slopes, the sulphurous stench of active fumaroles thickening the air like a curse. These weren't ordinary sacrifices, they were offerings hurled into the very throat of the god Tlaloc, where smoke and fire merged into a boundary between the living world and the realm of the dead. Victims chosen for this ritual wore elaborate headdresses adorned with jade and obsidian, their faces painted blue to mirror the storm god's visage. Spanish accounts describe the eerie silence that fell as priests approached the volcanic vents, the only sound the muffled sobs of the bound captives and the mountain's subterranean growls. The selection process was as precise as it was brutal. Geomancers, specialist priests trained in reading earth tremors, would monitor the volcano's activity for weeks, waiting for the moment when subterranean rumblings signaled Tlaloc's hunger. Victims weren't just thrown in randomly. Their weight, age, and even the pitch of their screams were calculated to balance the mountain's temperament. Excavations near the volcano's base have uncovered stone altars with grooves angled toward specific fumaroles, suggesting the Aztecs mapped which vents responded most dramatically to sacrifice. One particularly chilling discovery was a set of ceramic whistles shaped like crying children when blown. They emitted frequencies matching the harmonic vibrations recorded before eruptions. The act itself was a horrific ballet of precision and spectacle. Priests used Magi fiber ropes to lower victims into the vents, slowly enough for the heat to induce agonized convulsions, movements believed to mimic the god's own spasms during eruptions. Some chronicles mention victims surviving the initial drop, their screams echoing up the shaft until the gases silenced them. Modern volcanologists note an eerie correlation between sacrifice periods and temporary decreases in seismic activity, possibly due to the vent-blocking effect of human remains. The Aztecs interpreted this as divine appeasement, but the truth may be even darker. The mountain wasn't being calmed, it was being fed. Legend tells of one particularly lavish sacrifice during Moctezuma's reign, when the empire offered 100 prisoners during a months-long eruption. The Florentine Codex describes their bodies wrapped in gold-leafed shrouds, each clutching a jade figurine in their teeth as they plunged into the abyss. Within days, Popocatépetl fell eerily silent, an event the Aztecs celebrated as proof of their covenant with the earth. Geologic records confirm an unusual lull in eruptions around that time, though modern science attributes it to coincidental magma chamber shifts rather than supernatural bargaining. Archaeological finds near the summit reveal how deeply this ritual was woven into Aztec cosmology. A cache of gold discs etched with volcanic plumes was discovered in 2019, each disc perforated with holes corresponding to major fumaroles. When held up during eruptions, they created a grisly eclipse effect, the smoke and fire visible only through the victims assigned entry points into the underworld. Some discs still bear traces of a sticky, resinous substance identified as human adrenal gland extract, likely smeared to charge the offering with the terror of its final moments. What lingers today isn't just the horror, but the unsettling familiarity of the logic. When modern engineers pump water into geothermal vents to stabilize volcanoes, they unknowingly echo the Aztecs' desperate calculus that nature's fury can be negotiated if only we offer enough of ourselves to the flame. The mountain still rumbles, its slopes now dotted with Catholic crosses where Franciscan friars tried to exorcise the old gods. But some locals whisper that when Popocatépetl smoke thickens at dawn, you can still hear the echo of gold-leafed wrists snapping against volcanic rock, a debt collector's reminder that the earth never forgets what it's owed. The drums never stopped in those final days. Beneath the shadow of looming Spanish ships, Tenochtitlan's temples ran slick with blood as Moctezuma II ordered sacrifice on an unimaginable scale, not just to appease the gods, but to fortify the very fabric of reality itself. Priests, their arms caked in gore up to the elbows, moved in exhausted shifts between altars, flinging hearts into the sacred fire so fast the coals hissed continuously. Spanish accounts describe the stench of burning flesh so thick it drifted across Lake Texcoco, mingling with the salt air of Cortés' approaching fleet, an olfactory war between worlds. This wasn't ceremony anymore, it was triage. The Aztec calendar had foretold cycles of destruction and renewal, but nothing prepared them for the pale-skinned invaders who seemed to walk through plagues unharmed. In desperation, Moctezuma turned to the most extreme ritual in his arsenal, the Tlaloc, or Great Flaying of the World. For 30 days and nights, priests drained the blood of thousands, not just war captives, but volunteers from noble families, even the emperor's own kin. Their bodies processed like emergency rations for starving deities. The Templo Mayor's drains clogged with coagulated blood, forcing workers to dig emergency channels that turned the sacred precinct into a grisly delta. Archaeology confirms the surreal scale of these final acts. Excavations beneath Mexico City's Metropolitan Cathedral uncovered a mass grave unlike any other. Not the orderly armpantly skull racks, but a chaotic jumble of skeletons, many with multiple sacrificial wounds. Forensic analysis revealed some victims had been bled over days, kept alive with tourniquets and herbal stimulants to maximize each offering. others showed signs of being hastily dispatched mid-ritual, their spinal cuts uneven as if the executioner's hands were shaking. The most chilling evidence lies in the artifacts. Amidst the chaos, someone had meticulously arranged items for a ritual that would never be completed. Jade knives aligned to catch the equinox sunrise, piles of unused incense, and most hauntingly small clay figurines of Spanish conquistadors, their bodies painted with the same sacrificial blue as the victims. These weren't mere effigies, they were attempts at spiritual warfare, efforts to harness the magic of flaying against an enemy who fought with steel and smallpox. In the end, the blood wasn't enough. When Cortés finally breached the city, his men described pyramids so saturated with old blood that their stones wept red in the rain. The priests who survived were found curled around their altars, whispering to gods who had fallen silent, their fingers still clutching knives gone dull from overuse. What the Aztecs couldn't know was that their desperation had birthed a lasting legend. To this day, locals swear the soil around the Templo Mayor darkens unnaturally after heavy storms, as if the earth itself remembers the weight of all that spilled hope. The Aztecs didn't see death as an ending. It was the heartbeat of existence, the price paid at the cosmic marketplace where gods and mortals bartered for survival. Every ritual we've explored, from the flayed skins of Xipe Totec to the volcanic maw of Popocatépetl, wasn't just spectacle but sacred algebra, equations of flesh and faith balancing the universe's ledgers. Their world pulsed with reciprocity. A farmer's harvest demanded blood, the sun's rise required hearts, even rain fell only when tears watered the earth. This wasn't mere superstition, it was a cosmology where life and death danced in brutal symbiosis, each feeding the other in an endless cycle. Modern eyes might recoil at the violence, but to dismiss these practices as primitive misses their profound coherence. The Aztecs crafted a system where every scream had purpose, every drop of blood carried meaning, a stark contrast to our often arbitrary suffering. When archaeologists find traces of cortisol in sacrificial remains, it's a grim reminder. These victims weren't just dying, they were participating in what their culture deemed the ultimate act of meaning-making. Their agony, they believed, kept stars in motion and crops in the ground. Yet the true shock lies in the echoes we still live with today. The same logic that fueled the Tezonpantli's skulls pulses through modern system sacrifices, just take different forms. Soldiers sent to war, workers ground down for profit, even our obsession with burnout culture all whisper the old Aztec truth: society runs on spent lives. The scale has changed, but the arithmetic remains. Now we turn to you. Which ritual unraveled your assumptions the most? Was it the merchant princes drowning in Lake Texcoco, their wealth worthless against divine hunger? The children whose tears became rain, or the obsidian mirrors that turned priests into living radios tuning into godly frequencies? Drop your thoughts below, and if this journey through Aztec devotion hooked you, hit subscribe. The past isn't done with us yet, and every click is a spark to keep exploring history's shadowed corridors. Just remember, when you next feel the sun's warmth or watch rain patter against your window, you're benefiting from an ancient bargain. The Aztecs paid in blood. We just forget